More than 3.9 billion years have passed since the formation of planet Earth. The Precambrian phase, which successively encompasses the Hadean, Archean, and Proterozoic eons, was marked by the formation of the oceans, the cooling of the Earth, and the solidification of its crust, followed by the formation of the continents Columbia and Rodinia. But it also witnessed the appearance of life in the form of bacteria. Then later, during the Neoproterozoic era, the appearance of the Ediacaran marine fauna, with archaic organisms, but above all, the bilaterian metazoans. The Cambrian thus follows this first long period of almost 4 billion years. This is the first era of a long series that makes up the Phanerozoic eon, which extends to the present day, itself divided into 4 subcategories. The first corresponds to the Paleozoic eon, or primary era, beginning with the Cambrian. The second subcategory is the Mesozoic, or secondary era. Then follows the Tertiary, and finally, the Quaternary eras, grouped together under the Cenozoic eon, which saw the appearance of the first primates and the evolution of many species as we know them today. But let's return to the period we're interested in, the starting point of the Paleozoic era, the Cambrian period. Spanning the period from 541 to 485 million years ago, this is the oldest of the 6 Paleozoic periods. What happened during these 56 million years that marked a decisive turning point, to the point of being defined as the starting point of a new and one of the greatest divisions of geological time, namely the Phanerozoic eon? Let's start with the etymology of the word Cambrian. The term was introduced in 1935 by Adam Sedgwick, a British geologist considered one of the founders of modern geology. The name Cambrian is derived from Cambria, the Latin name for Wales. The name was chosen because this region of the world is home to numerous sites where stigmata of the period in question were first identified. Thanks to stratigraphy, the science of the Earth that studies the different geological layers, or strata, geologists have agreed to divide the Cambrian into 4 geological subdivisions, themselves accumulating 10 successive stages. Thus, the Cambrian period covers the Terra Nuvian from 541 to 521 million years ago, and Series 2 from 521 to 509 million years ago. The Terra Nuvian alone represents more than a third of the Cambrian in terms of duration. These first 2 eras are also known as the Lower Cambrian and the Georgian. They include the Fortunian stage as well as stages 2, 3, and 4. The base of the Cambrian is marked by the appearance of the Treptichnus pedum fossil record. These are complex fossilized burrows found in seabed sediments all over the world. Treptichnus pedum are thus the stigmata of animal activity on the seabed as they move and search for food. Unfortunately, no fossils of these animals were found in the sediment studied. The mystery remains, all the more so as the organisms responsible for these branching, sinuous burrows are far more complex than the animals of the Ediacara fauna that existed just before. Stages 2, 3, and 4 are marked respectively by the appearance of archaeocyaths, the first reef-building metazoans, and small shelly fossils, which are shell-like microfossils of metazoans represented by sponges, mollusks, annelids, lobopods, and other forms that don't seem to belong to any current phylum. Trilobites also appeared during this period. Then comes the Meolingian period, from 509 to 497 million years ago, which brings together 3 additional stages: the Woolian stage, the Drumian stage, and the Gajangian stage. During this period, trilobite varieties multiplied intensely. Traces of Erectocephalus indicus have been found in Guizhou province in China and in Nevada. Later came Tychignostus atavus, the now extinct trilobite species. Specimens have been found in western Utah. The base of the Gajangian 7th stage is defined by the appearance of the trilobite Lizopyge levigata, discovered in northwest Hunan, China. Finally, the last Cambrian period stretches from 497 to 485 million years ago, and includes the Pabian, Jiangshanian, and finally the 10th stage, which forms the basis of the period that follows the Cambrian, the Ordovician. New trilobite species continue to appear during this period, but it is the appearance of the conodont, Lapitognathus fluctivagus, that marks the upper limit of the Cambrian. This prehistoric animal has the particularity of having cone-shaped teeth, as indicated by its name, composed of the Latin words teeth and cones. But what might the planet have looked like during the Cambrian period, which marks the beginning of the Lower Paleozoic? In the Precambrian eon, Rodinia was a megacontinent that brought together all the continental masses. Under the influence of plate tectonics, it gradually fragmented. Pieces of continental crust began to drift away across the vastness of the oceans. Shortly before the Cambrian era, 2 new continents appeared. Laurentia, the larger of the two, forms much of the North America we know today, minus Florida, as well as Greenland and Scotland. The second, less important, corresponds to the Siberian Shield. At the beginning of the Cambrian, a 3rd piece of Rodinia broke off. Named Baltica, it gave rise to present-day Russia, Poland, Scandinavia, and northern Germany. The amputated Rodinia continent was renamed Gondwana. However, it was still vast, encompassing South America, Africa, Australia, Antarctica, Southern Europe, and finally China. As the 3 newly formed landmasses of Laurentia, Siberia, and Baltica came into being, they were subjected to the effects of plate tectonics. They moved towards and away from each other. Oceans formed while others closed. The Lapitous Ocean opened up between Laurentia and Gondwana when the supercontinent Rodinia broke up. Over millions of years, this Paleo-ocean slowly expanded into the southern hemisphere, thanks to the spreading of the ocean floor in conjunction with a mid-ocean ridge located between the 2 continents. Around 50 million years after the opening of the Lapitous Ocean, at the end of the Cambrian, a new event gradually modified this part of the globe, reversing the opening process. A subduction zone, south of Laurentia, where one oceanic lithospheric plate slipped beneath another, created an island volcanic arc. Volcanic discharges from the island arc mingled for a long time with the great thickness of sand and mud that had already accumulated between the Laurentia continent and this space riddled with volcanic islands. Sediments then accumulated in this zone, leading some 20 million years later in the Silurian to the closure of this ocean, all the more so as small continental masses, also uncoupled from the Great Gondwana continent, slid northwards. Together, these circumstances led to the gradual closure of Iapetus. As the insular volcanic arc moved closer to Laurentia, it eventually collided with the continental margin and began the long process of building a mountain range, the premise of the Caledonian orogeny, which would much later give rise to the Appalachians in North America and the ranges of Scotland and Scandinavia. The Cambrian began as the last ice age of the Proterozoic. The gas-gear's glaciation was coming to an end. A gradual and continuous warming of the climate led to average temperatures well above those we know today. But were the continents thus formed suitable for the development of any form of life? Although the climate seemed favorable, with average global temperatures estimated at 25 degrees Celsius or 77 degrees Fahrenheit, the continents that then occupied mainly equatorial zones were nevertheless, unlike the oceans, devoid of any signs of life. However, thanks to cyanobacteria, the first algae to appear and play a crucial role on Earth, the great oxygenation of the planet occurred, opening up the field of possibilities. Laurentia, Siberia, and Baltica thus enjoyed a tropical climate. Gondwana, located near the polar zone, experienced relatively cold temperatures, but without a land cover of ice. The intertropical zone, on the other hand, was more arid. The atmosphere contained 20% oxygen and 0.5% carbon dioxide, but the ozone layer was far too thin to protect the surface continents. Relatively exposed to ultraviolet radiation, they were unable to support any form of life. With no plant cover whatsoever, the continent surfaces were totally barren, desert-like and arid. Only the movement of tectonic plates and intense erosion eventually altered the appearance of these lands, which consisted of rocky peaks or barren, cracked plains. The shallow oceans, on the other hand, were able to take full advantage of these conditions to develop the life already present, thanks to their warm waters. At the beginning of the period, only unicellular, then multicellular organisms populated the submarine space. Prokaryotes, single-celled microorganisms with no nucleus or nuclear membrane, such as bacteria and archaea, were found. Then, in addition to the many cyanobacteria, came the eukaryotes, which had appeared during the Proterozoic eon. But we'll see later how climatic conditions played a major role in the evolution of these species over the 56 million years that make up the Cambrian period. Some 600 million years ago, towards the end of the Proterozoic eon, just before the Cambrian era, the Ediacaran fauna, composed of soft-bodied, leaf and tube-shaped organisms, developed for almost 56 million years before suddenly disappearing. The reasons for this sudden disappearance remain an unsolved mystery to this day. However, traces of this fauna have been found all over the world. It was made up of primitive representatives of younger groups, essentially the Cnidarian phylum, soft and medusoid corals, annelids, segmented worms, and arthropods. One of the few survivors of this short period is the jellyfish. But the event that followed was of such importance that it marked the beginning of a new era, the Cambrian. The Cambrian is the era that marks the beginning of fossiliferous times. Following the last ice age of the Proterozoic, the planet underwent a transmutation. Temperatures were much milder, and an unprecedented extension of the epicontinental seas allowed underwater life to develop at an unprecedented rate, but not only in terms of quantity. On a geological timescale, new anatomies appeared on such a scale that we speak of a Cambrian explosion. This was the first evolutionary event of its kind, marking a decisive turning point in the evolution of life on Earth. Some authors have even dubbed it the zoological Big Bang. Most of today's major metazoan phyla appeared between 541 and 505 million years ago. Although some of these multicellular animals have since disappeared, this Cambrian explosion was the initiator of a great diversification of animal, plant, and bacterial classes and species. Living organisms acquired shells, carapaces, and even skeletons, leaving their mark on fossils. Most of these were soft-bodied animals, such as worms and sponges, but the first arthropods, distant ancestors of crustaceans and insects, also appeared. There are also traces of the cephalopods of the future, including the octopus. The rapid emergence of new animal varieties, particularly bilaterians, made ecosystems much more complex than they had been before, when they were populated by relatively simple organisms, as witnessed by the Ediacaran population. Completely new ecological interactions, such as predation, appeared in new marine environments and habitats. Some so-called benthic species lived on the seabed, or even in the sediment covering it. Others, on the other hand, evolved in the aquatic environment. These are known as nectonic animals. The causes of the Cambrian explosion are still not really known. However, several hypotheses have been put forward, some of which are linked to one another. The first is based on an increase in dissolved oxygen in the oceans following the end of the last ice age. There may also have been an increase in the production of phosphate and nitrate ions, essentially for primary photosynthetic production, and enabling phytoplankton development and mineralization of hard parts, such as shells and sclerites. Changes in the food chain, inducing competition between prey and predators, may have favored co-evolutionary mechanisms between different species. As a result, new and vital defense strategies, such as carapaces, shells, and spines, would have developed, offering primordial protection against predators, themselves finely equipped with visual elements. And then there's the question, of whether small genetic changes may have occurred accidentally during the embryonic development of certain species. You're probably wondering, and rightly so, about the evidence that has been found from this period. It is indeed legitimate to wonder how fossilized traces of these microorganisms, which moreover lived exclusively on the seabed, can be discovered. If it's hard enough to bring to light the fossilized remains of dinosaurs that appeared almost 300 million years later, what stigmata can be exploited? Fortunately, a large part of the Lapitous Ocean seabed has been preserved. As plate tectonics continually shaped the Earth's crust, surfaces in the ocean depths were raised to mountain slopes. This explosion of life left many fossils that can be found all over the globe. Traces of the Cambrian period can be found all over the world, on every continent. However, current knowledge of life during the Cambrian is based on the study of the Lager state, the storage site still available, where paleontologists are continuing their research. The Cambrian is also well represented in France. Numerous fossils have been discovered in the southwestern Massif Central, more precisely in the Montagne Noire, but also in the Pyrenees, Normandy, the Cevennes, in small outcrops in the Pays de la Loire, and finally in the Ardennes. The first Cambrian fossils to be discovered in France date back to 1888. Trilobite debris was identified in the Montagne Noire, where the stratigraphy subsequently proved to be particularly representative of the Cambrian era. The Burgess Shale is one of the world's most remarkable storage sites. Discovered on August 30th, 1909, by paleontologist Charles Doolittle Walcott, they are located near Mount Burgess, high in the Canadian Rockies, in the heart of Yoho National Park. It's a black shale deposit where fossils, most of them around 505 million years old, bear witness to the end of the Cambrian explosion. Shale is a type of sedimentary rock composed of clay and silt. Often very friable, these rocks reveal the fossilized remains of surprising, even disconcerting creatures. As we noted earlier, the mountains of the Canadian Rockies were once the seabed of the Lapitous Ocean. Sediments were deposited in the deep waters in the form of mud flows, capturing the animals present in this area. The scarcity of oxygen slowed their decomposition, so over time they were transformed into black, thread-like fossils. Skeletal elements from the Cambrian period are generally small in size. They come from small-shelled fauna. Different parts of mineralized skeletons are studied, such as sclerites, the calcareous part included in the tissues of certain corals, spicules, the calcareous or siliceous constituents, forming the skeleton of sponges, tubes, or shells. These elements probably belong to several different types of animal, but what is most remarkable about the Burgess fauna is the appearance of specific internal and external organs. At last, the animals were equipped with legs, visual attributes, a mouth, digestive system, antennae, and many other special features. To date, almost 150 species of animals, algae, and bacteria have been recorded in Walcott's Quarry. Thousands of specimens are divided into several collections, enabling scientists to study the ecosystem as a whole. Quantitative statistics are now possible for the first time thanks to the sheer quantity of fossils. Researchers estimate that almost 98% of the fossils on this site are those of soft-bodied organisms. The site's unique preservation conditions make it exceptional. Indeed, in most Cambrian marine deposits worldwide, this type of fossil is absent, not because they weren't there, but because they were not preserved in the right conditions. The Burgess community is essentially made up of animals. A few species of green algae and red algae have been recorded, as well as microbial colonies. But the groups most representative of this new environment are undoubtedly the arthropods, those small animals with articulated legs that molt, and the porifers, i.e. the sponges. Without further ado, let's take a look at the species that populated this paleo-ocean, then called Iapetus. Let's start with the most widespread animals, the benthics, i.e. those living in or near the seabed. Catastrophic perfecta is one of the ancestors of the arthropods found today in the form of crustaceans, insects, and arachnids. This specimen, which also left traces in China, measured from 8 to 52 millimeters in length. Its body was partially covered by a carapace and ended in a segmented tail with a telson at the tip, which itself had a double spiny projection pointing backwards. Its bivalve carapace was surmounted by two eyes, between which a spinal column began. It was equipped with one pair of short antennae and another, longer pair, whose function was probably olfactory. Two pairs of legs were located at the level of its head, all equipped with a terminal claw. More than a dozen segments made up its body. The thoracic part was equipped with 8 pairs of associated biramous legs, similarly equipped with claws, while its posterior abdomen was devoid of them. Legs or appendages are said to be biramous when they have both gills and locomotor appendages. Catastrophic perfecta walked along the seabed, stirring up mud with its feet to find its food. Once the food was found, it used its pair of mandibles and maxillae to feed. Among the animals that inhabited the seabed, many species with elongated bodies resembling today's worms lived on the seabed or in the sediment that covered it. Others had a particular morphology that enabled them to swim actively. These elongated animals belong to the category of annelids. 5 species have been recorded in the Burgess Shale, including Piranacheta, which preferred a sedimentary environment, and Canadia spinosa, which swam with ocean currents. Let's take a look at the Canadia spinosa. This annelid worm measured an average of 3 centimeters or 1 inch long, and could reach up to 4.5 centimeters or 2 inches in length. The main characteristic of this animal is the numerous rigid bristles that extend from its dorsal branches all the way down its back. This feature is typical of polychaete worms. On their distinctive segmented structure, each segment carries a pair of conspicuous lateral appendages called parapodia, used primarily for locomotion. On these parapodia, tufts of a variable number of bristles, the chaetae, facilitate their movement in the aquatic environment. The Peronachetae, on the other hand, preferred contact with sediments. This tiny, thread-like hairworm takes its name from the Greek words peroni, meaning needle, and kate, meaning long hair, in reference to the bristles that cover it. This worm grew to between 1 and 2 centimeters or 1 inch in length, with a body just 1 millimeter wide without the bristles. Its body consisted of around 25 segments, each equipped with a pair of parapodia. This carnivorous, even detritivorous animal had a straight intestine running the length of its body. Its cephalic region was equipped with a pair of tentacles. This worm was endobenthic and epibenthic, which means it could move both on sediments and within them. Its bristles, very useful for its movements, probably helped it to bury itself in the sediment, both to hide and to search for food. But a much larger worm was discovered in the astonishing Burgess fauna. This is the Capinitator praetermissus, a worm that proved to be a formidable predator during the Cambrian period. Considered a monster, it measured 11 centimeters or 4 inches, and its broad head was lined with 50 hooks. Nicknamed a Sagittarian worm because of its arrow-like shape, it is described as a chatognath. The name chatognate means jaw hair. In fact, it was its numerous movable hooks that enabled it to capture its prey. This worm is considered a branch of marine predators. Even today, this type of worm can be found in all seas. Although they haven't changed much, they are now often only a few millimeters long. Yet nestled among the plankton, it behaves like a fearsome predator, its hooks claiming numerous victims among the larvae of fish and crustaceans. The seabed was also occupied by brachiopods, animals that fed on suspended particles and whose bodies were housed in bivalve shells. Generally, they attached themselves to a surface on the seabed or to another larger organism by means of their peduncle, a cylindrical, flexible organ. Micromitra burgessensis was one of these brachiopods, whose maximum size was 10 millimeters. Its name comes from the Greek and means little turban. It was the most equipped of the brachiopods found at the Burgess site. It had a mineralized shell. This was adorned with pronounced striations of growth and fine raised lines raising out from the hinge across the entire shell, creating small diamond-shaped patterns on the top. Its valves were subcircular, while its hinge was practically straight. This specimen was also adorned with long, thin bristles that extended well beyond the margins of its shell. These were attached to the edge of the mantle, along the dorsal and ventral valves. Some of these specimens have been found fossilized while attached to the spicules of a variety of sponge, the Piranha sponge, confirming its benthic lifestyle. In the waters of this ocean, animals were actively swimming. This was particularly true of the chordates, animals with dorsal ropes and dorsal spinal cords. Pangea gracilens, one of the fossils found in the Burgess Shale, undoubtedly represents the most primitive form of chordate. At the time, this ancestor of vertebrates only looked like a worm. However, it has been demonstrated that this animal was equipped with myomeres, the muscles of vertebrates. It measured around 5 centimeters or 2 inches in length. Its elongated body, with a head at the front, gave it the appearance of an eel. Its body, flattened at the sides, suggests that it had a ventral fin located towards the rear. Although this animal spent a lot of time on the seabed in search of food, looking for organic matter such as snails or sea urchins, it could probably swim at will. One of the arthropods had 2 pedunculated eyes. This is the Sydneyea. With a maximum size of 160 millimeters or 6 inches, it had a convex, cephalic shield, short but wide and subrectangular in frontal view. The 2 lateral corners were notched to accommodate an antenna and eye stalk on either side. Its 2 hemispherical, highly reflective eyes pointed above and behind each antenna. Its thorax was composed of 9 segments, the middle ones being wider. The first 4 thoracic segments had appendages with a large base and 8 lighter ones ending in a sharp claw. The next 5 thoracic segments had identical appendages, but these were associated with branches of filaments, forming what could be described as a wing. Finally, its abdomen was made up of 3 much thinner segments and ended in a triangular telson, accompanied by a pair of large articulated paddles, forming a caudal fan. This carnivore swam and walked on the seabed with the help of its 4 anterior pairs of thoracic appendages, while the filamentous branches of its 5 posterior pairs enabled it to propel itself through the water column. These same filaments may even have participated in the animal's breathing, acting as gills. Its spiny basal coxae helped it to crush food and transport it to its mouth. Its eyes and antennae helped it to move above the seabed in search of its prey, which it had to grasp and then crush with its front appendages. Another primitive arthropod had not 2 but 5 eyes. This was Opabinia regulus. Because of its unusual morphology, including a strange frontal proboscis, it is one of the iconic fossils of the Burgess fauna. Its body, whose maximum size was 10.1 centimeters or 4 inches, featured gills and lateral lobes repeated in series, as well as a generously proportioned caudal fan. Its complete body, measured without its proboscis, was between 4.3 and 7 centimeters, or 2 inches. On the anterior margin of its rounded head were 5 prominent eyes. They were bulbous in shape, surmounted by short peduncles. Its ring proboscis was 4 times the size of its head. Extremely flexible, it ended in a pair of opposing pincers, each with 5 or 6 spines. The ventral mouth was directed backwards. Its trunk was composed of 15 segments, each housing a pair of lateral lobes, themselves bearing gill structures in the form of lamellae. The trunk was followed by a caudal fan with 3 pairs of upward-facing fins. This carnivorous animal swam thanks to the waves of undulations produced by its lateral lobes, which acted as propellers. Its caudal fan, like a rudder, helped it to steer through the water column. Its flexible proboscis and pair of distal pincers were invaluable for catching soft foods and bringing them to its ventral mouth. The seabed was certainly colored by echinoderms. Echinoderms are a distinct group of organisms characterized by a mineralized skeleton made up of several elements with pentameric symmetry. We find this structure today in starfish, whose bodies contain 5 identical parts, radiating from a central point. Naturally, carnivorous animals were fed on mollusks in large numbers. Of the 5 species discovered in the Burgess Shale, only one had a mineralized shell, the Scanella. Sponges also populated the ocean floor. They are among the most primitive animals known to the oceans. Their bodies had no real tissues. Many of these species had a skeleton made up of a mesh of fine mineral rods known as spicules. These demosponges were benthic filter feeders. They therefore belong to the phylum Poriferae. Specimens of several species of the Voxia genus have been found in the Burgess Shale, including Voxia gracilenta. This sponge, very common on this site, measured a maximum of 8 centimeters. Simple and unbranched, or with more complex structures, each of its branches was almost cylindrical, forming a highly accentuated cone with a simple central cavity with a concave or flat opening. To feed, these sessile creatures had no other means than to continually filter water through the channels in their walls in order to retain the particles of organic matter then present. Other species, with variations in skeletal elements and branch shape, were also widespread, such as Voxia bullula and Voxia densa. These could reach up to 15 centimeters or 6 inches in height. Anchored to the seabed, they provided perfect shelter for epibenthic fauna, whose habitat was essentially the seabed. But the best-known sponge in the Burgess Shale is undoubtedly the Hazelia palmata. It is assigned to the upper group of demosponges of the order Monaxidina. The Hazelia genus is highly diversified. It includes species of various morphologies. Some were large and cup-shaped, such as Hazelia palmata, Hazelia crateria, and Hazelia luteria. Others were elongated and conical, such as Hazelia conferta, Hazelia grandis, and Hazelia obscura. There were also some particularly branched species, such as Hazelia delicutala, and others in the form of nodules or lobes, such as Hazelia lobata and Hazelia nodulifera. However, despite the considerable diversity of their general forms, these species all had the same microstructure. They were thin-walled and composed of small spicules densely grouped together in a mesh-like structure that opened outwards. Hazelia palmata, which measured up to 15 centimeters or 6 inches, was distinguished by its open, shield-like shape and numerous clusters of prominent radiating spicules. Among the arthropods active on the seabed alongside these sponges was the Naroya, often compared to trilobites. This marine animal, at most 4 centimeters or 2 inches long, had 2 ovoid dorsal shields with a convex axial region. It therefore had a cephalic shield and an elongated shield protecting the rest of its body. 2 long, articulated antennae protruded from the anterior shield. Behind the antennae were 4 pairs of cephalic appendages, with a further 14 pairs on the trunk. Each of these appendages was segmented and bi-branched. One part formed the locomotor branch, divided into 7 segments and thus perfectly adapted to walking. The other part was a filamentous branch, consisting of a fine shaft from which numerous lamellae sprang. These appendages ended in a large spiny plate. Thanks to its antennae, which were probably sensory, the Naroya was able to locate its food, which it brought to its mouth using the spiny plate at the base of its appendages. It could, however, take short swims, using its filamentous gills to propel it through the aquatic environment. If this carnivore was a scavenger, even a predator, the scars found on the carapace of certain specimens prove that it was also attacked by larger predators. Finally, a carnivore with a tubular carapace completes the list of arthropods. This is the Odaria alata. Most of this animal's body was enveloped by an imposing carapace, the midline of which was visible along the dorsal midline. These 2 united valves on the ventral part make this specimen very special, its carapace forming an open tube at the front and rear of the animal. Its head, which protruded from the tube, had a small anterior plate containing large spherical eyes surmounted by short peduncles. Its body consisted of around 47 segments, each with a pair of appendages. Those of the first 2 segments took the form of slender segmented branches adapted to walking. The other appendages were bi-branched and divided into an inner branch with a large branched basal spine and an outer branch with filamentous lamellae. Its tail, or telson, consisted of 3 fins extending laterally and vertically. This predator's ventral appendages, blocked by its tubular carapace, probably made it difficult for it to walk on the seabed. Nevertheless, the Odaria was a mobile animal. It could plausibly swim in the water column, thanks to the undulation of its internal branches and biramid appendages. Like a suction pipe, it filtered aquatic organisms that entered at the front and exited at the rear of its carapace. Its large telson, very useful when on the move, helped it to steer, and why not, to manage rolling or braking when swimming. As you can see, this paleo-ocean was teeming with life, even if sea monsters were only small in size at the time. On a zoological scale, the Cambrian explosion led to an unprecedented diversification of animal species. Above all, it marked the emergence of modern ecosystems. The biodiversity of marine life during the Cambrian is also perfectly illustrated in a region of southwest China. Various sites in Chengjiang, located in Yunnan province, are renowned for the quality of preservation of the fossils discovered, including their soft parts. The Chengjiang fauna came after the small shell fauna that marked the beginning of the Cambrian period. New life forms appeared at this time, some 520 million years ago. One of the sites, Mao Tianshan Hill, has been a UNESCO World Heritage Site since 2012. It was on this hill that this lager state was discovered by Dr. Qian Guang Hao of the Nanjing Institute of Geology and Paleontology in 1984. The Chengjiang fossils comprise 16 phyla, over 170 genera, and more than 200 different species. They mark the first appearance of the majority of animal phyla existing during the Phanerozoic, many of which still populate our planet. The first specimens of algae, sponges, brachiopods, arthropods, chordates, and echinoderms have been found. But the long list doesn't end there. Hallucigenia is one of the most studied specimens. This animal, then considered a polychaete worm of the Canadia genus, has been extremely well preserved, providing experts with precious anatomical details. It had an oval-shaped head, attached to its cylindrical body by a constriction giving it a neck. Measuring 22 millimeters or 1 inch in length, it had 7 pairs of dorsal spines and 7 pairs of legs, with small claws at the ends. Today, it is classified as a lobopod. One of the most popular inhabitants of the Changjiang fauna is a numerous arthropod, some specimens of which are in an excellent state of preservation. This is the Leoncholia illicabrosa. It can be recognized by its elongated segmented body, its biramid appendages, and above all, its 2 large head appendages, each bearing 3 flagellas about 2 centimeters or 1 inch long. Another common animal has revealed numerous anatomical details. This is Urodlichia intermedia, a trilobite that revealed fine uniramate antennae on the front of its head, large crescent-shaped eyes framing a rounded area extended by 2 long spines. Its posterior part ended in a long thorn-like tail. But the most famous fossil in the Changjiang fauna is undoubtedly the Mylocunmingia vengioa. It represents the oldest known vertebrate. At around 2 centimeters or 1 inch in length, it is a small primitive fish. Its head was distinct from its trunk. It had 5 to 6 gills. Its trunk was equipped with a dorsal and ventral fin, probably twinned. The thorax had 25 V-shaped segments, with the tip turned backwards. While the location of its mouth is not yet clear, it did have a pharynx, as well as a digestive tract that extended to the tip of its tail. Another species stands out in the Changjiang fauna, this time for its size. This is the Anomalocaris sauron. This predator of the now extinct Anomalocaridae family, also known as the strange shrimp, could measure over 1 meter in length, which is quite exceptional and even spectacular for this period of animal history. Its anterior part was equipped with a pair of large segmented prehensile appendages, edged with spines. Its head was surmounted by 2 large pedunculated eyes, while its underside featured a characteristic ringed mouth. Its segmented body, composed of 11 pairs of lobes, probably made it a very good swimmer. Thus equipped, it must have had no difficulty in feeding on trilobites, which it hunted with a sharp eye. In this complex ecosystem, scientists deduced that over 55% of species were arthropods, 10% were sponges. In addition, more than 10% are still of uncertain form. Most of the fauna lived on the ocean floor. Indeed, few of the specimens we have just observed were pelagic, as their structure was not equipped with elements that would enable them to swim, even passively. Feeding habits were equally varied. There were filter feeders and fearsome predators. While some of these animals were content to scavenge from the sediment, others were active hunters. At the Chengjiang site, the Cambrian explosion is anything but a legend. The diversification of life is well represented, notably with the appearance of numerous phyla previously unheard of. While many descendants emerged within a single phylum, some endured while others died out in later geological times. Whatever the case, this period witnessed the emergence of all the complex forms of animal life as we know it today. In the Lower Cambrian era, during the first two series of the Terranuvian and Series 2, a short period stood out, giving rise to the Tomotian fauna, named after the Siberian town of Tomot. This fauna appeared during the Cambrian explosion 530 million years ago, but lasted only a few million years. Yet, like the Ediacara fauna, it is similarly recognized around the globe. The Tomotian fauna is also often referred to as the small-shelled fauna, and for good reason. While it contains some organisms that look modern for their time, most of its representatives are formed of tiny blades, tubes, needles, caps, or domes. For paleontologists, the nature of this small-shelled fauna remains a mystery. Are they simply scattered fragments of the very first types of shells, still imperfectly formed by unrecognizable organisms? Or are they remnants of pieces of shell that covered previously known but unidentified animals whose construction improved over time? Or do these strange finds correspond to unique organisms that appeared early before spontaneously disappearing? Until recently, the Tomotian fauna was considered to be the first fauna with hard parts. But recent discoveries of organisms with mineralized skeletons have shown the opposite to be true, the latter being found in the stratified layers of the late Precambrian and early Cambrian. Nevertheless, the Tomotian fauna is also important for another reason. It marks the appearance of a group of organisms that most probably belong to the Porifera phylum, that of the sponges, the Archaeocyaths. Although this phylum disappeared at the end of the Cambrian, Archaeocyaths were the very first bioconstructors in association with calcimicrobes, calcifying microbial communities. They were able to generate organic masses measuring 1 to 2 meters in height and a few meters in diameter. These calcified sponges would then adorn the seabed like never before. These massive organisms were the precursors of the complex reef ecosystem that developed a few million years later, toward the end of the Ordovician period. All that remains of the Tomotian fauna is the sponge category. If organisms were able to develop on such a scale during the Cambrian, they were not the only ones. We have already observed a superpredator known as Anomalocaris. This strange, extraordinarily large shrimp, sometimes more than a meter long, wasn't the only one to rain terror on the ocean floor. A recent discovery, published in June 2022, mentions the existence of another giant arthropod, belonging to the Radiodont group. This is the Titanocoris gainesi. Its remains have just been found in the Burgess Shale fossil formation in British Columbia's Kootenay National Park. Its name, a reference to the word Titan, is self-explanatory and testifies to the exceptional size of this animal. The suffix coris means helmet in Greek. At around half a meter in length, the size of this animal was absolutely breathtaking at that time in animal history. While today, it may seem almost insignificant, it's worth remembering that at the same period, the vast majority of living creatures were no more than a fifth of this size, with the exception of the Anomalocaris sauron we met earlier. Like its herded cousins, a subgroup of radiodonts, Titanosaurus gainaceae was characterized by an exceptionally long head, covered by a three-part carapace of multiple shapes. The head of this specimen was so disproportionately elongated in relation to the rest of the body that some refer to it as a swimming head. Its mouth was shaped like a cone, with several radiating plates lined with teeth. Stemmed eyes with several facets crowned the mouth. A pair of long frontal appendages, ending in claws and pointing backwards, flanked its head. Finally, its trunk, made up of multiple flaps that were certainly intended to facilitate swimming, supported gills and ended in a front spine. This colossus, whose outer carapace was wider and thinner than that of the average radiodon, must have swum close to the seabed. Adapted to life close to the ground, it was most likely one of the most dangerous predators the oceans could count on during the Cambrian era. Smaller radiodonts, on the other hand, although with similar physical characteristics, were filter feeders. This probably explains the possible cohabitation of these two radiodont varieties, with Titanosaurus gainaceae certainly preferring to devour larger prey than its cousins. The study of exceptional faunas such as those of Chengjiang, Burgess, and many others, together with abundant paleontological data, allow us to assert that a complex marine ecosystem newly emerged at the beginning of the Cambrian. While the animal world preceding the Cambrian explosion was already highly diversified, comprising several phyla each, with different strategies for exploiting the environment, the anatomical organization of specimens was still relatively simple. During the Cambrian, we witnessed not only an unprecedented proliferation of living organisms, but above all, the emergence of new anatomical and functional formations, far more complex than ever before. From a sensory point of view, evolution is marked by the appearance of eye organs and antennae. Organisms are equipped with gills and a circulatory system, demonstrating that they had a respiratory system. In terms of feeding, complex digestive systems emerged. Some animals possess systems for capturing food particles, and in the case of predators, even prehensile organs. Finally, in terms of locomotion, more or less numerous appendages and flotation organs also appeared. Not to be forgotten are the prominent appendages found in arthropods, some of which have given rise to groups such as the crustaceans. These new anatomical peculiarities are accompanied by an increasingly complex marine ecosystem. Animals are no longer simple unicellular organisms like prokaryotes or eukaryotes, or even multicellular like certain myxobacteria. They are now endowed with a variety of specific organs, depending on which phylum they belong to. The discovery of organisms of different designs indicates the existence of an already highly structured food chain. Indeed, we find preapulin worms inside the sediment, numerous arthropods that lived on the seabed, and even swimming predators such as the fearsome Anomalocaris. But the anatomy of these organisms, miraculously preserved in the fossils, isn't the only clue to learning more about these newly appeared animals. In some deposits, scientists have been able to analyze the stomach contents and coprolites of certain specimens. Observations of the fossilized food in the stomach, and even of the excrement, still present in the intestines, has provided relatively precise indications of the diet of some of these animals. In this way, it has been possible to establish that certain species fed on other animal varieties. These stomach contents provide direct evidence of animal interactions within the food chain. In the Burgess Shale, several organic and skeletal elements have been found preserved inside the stomach or intestine of some of the animals studied. The priapulin worm, Otoya, seemed to feed on hyoliths, those enigmatic horn-shelled organisms. Several aligned shells were identified in its digestive tract. The arthropod, Sydneia, on the other hand, had a varied diet. Numerous fragments of hyoliths, trilobites, and bradorids, small bivalve arthropods, were found in the digestive tract of this carnivorous predator, which measured between 5 and 16 centimeters, or 5 inches in length. But scientists weren't content to simply observe the digestive tracts of certain species. Among the fossils examined, some could be coprolites. These potential fossil excrements come in different shapes. Some, elliptical and composed of aggregates of skeletal elements, belong to the Chengjiang fauna. They turn out to contain mostly fragments of waptids and bradorids, the small bivalve arthropods that populated the seabed. These are probably excrements produced by one of the largest predators, the Anomalocaris, which measured almost a meter in length. Other clusters discovered in the form of a ribbon and consisting almost entirely of hyoliths are undoubtedly the remains of carnivorous priapulin worms. These observations suggest that endobenthic predators, such as priapulins, were not the only ones to exploit the water-sediment interface. Arthropods, which moved along the bottom, and Anomalocarids, which moved through the water column, shared the same hunting grounds. In addition, traces of attacks and perforations were found on the carapace of some trilobites. Surely inflicted by Anomalocaridids, they testify to the bloodthirsty atmosphere that reigned on the seabed. Fractures and traces of regeneration, certainly due to predation, have also been noted on the shells of an Australian Lower Cambrian mollusk, Marocella. These small organisms, with biomineralized exoskeletons, were similarly subjected to constant predation. The Cambrian was thus marked by the appearance of the first ecosystems with a complex trophic structure, particularly in the animal sphere. Biological interactions, such as predator-prey relationships, are evident. New ecological niches, both benthic and pelagic, were occupied by a variety of predators, including scavengers, detritus feeders, and suspension feeders. Although the pelagic domain was probably not entirely occupied by swimming species during the Lower Cambrian, the concentration of animals in hyperbenthic environments close to the bottom is obvious. This was certainly the first step towards colonization of the water column, followed by the emergence of pelagic food chains. But what were the factors that triggered such an evolution? The establishment of this entirely new ecosystem is based on a number of decisive events and innovations. In the early stages of Metazoan evolution, climate, water, chemistry, and oxygen were most likely important environmental factors. But the acquisition by some species of a more complex nervous system, novel visual organs, and improved motor skills will certainly have enabled the introduction of new selective pressures such as predation. The light switch theory suggests that the introduction of vision into early Cambrian aquatic communities was the main trigger for this ecological renewal. This would have generated a completely new mode of animal interaction and triggered active predation. A cascade of feedback effects followed, such as defensive responses from certain prey, with the appearance of exoskeletons, biomineralization, and even new behaviors. Crucial improvements in the functioning of the nervous system in early Metazoans may have led to the emergence of new vital functions such as vision, limb coordination, locomotion, and even active predation. These new abilities undeniably modified the behavior of fauna, considerably changing ecological rules. Other hypotheses have suggested that major changes in phytoplankton composition took place during the transition from Precambrian to Cambrian, enabling an explosion in animal radiation. An increase in atmospheric oxygen could also have made possible the physical evolution of large animals with higher metabolisms. However, animal biomineralization during this same period is the most important event recorded. Its repercussions on the functioning of early ecosystems can only have been extremely significant. While the Cambrian period saw an unprecedented boom in the development of life, a first extinction followed the Cambrian explosion, which seems to have peaked between 520 and 540 million years ago. But a significant event occurred around 485 million years ago. During this first period of the Paleozoic era, multicellular beings underwent one of the many biological crises that would affect all life forms in subsequent periods. Over 85% of the biosphere's species disappeared. So what happened on the planet to have such an impact on life? While it is acknowledged that 99% of the species that have ever existed on our planet eventually became extinct, the vast majority did so as part of a process of normal species extinction, linked to the limited duration of their biological existence. However, the Cambrian period saw the sudden disappearance of certain species, as did many others that punctuated the development of life on Earth. Some researchers suggest that at the beginning of the Middle Cambrian, the climate underwent rapid oscillations between hot and cold. These climatic changes would have been so rapid that many species would not have had time to adapt, and consequently to survive. A great global cooling and variations in sea level would have modified the terrestrial environment, considerably impacting living conditions on the planet. But what is their theory based on? Geoscientists have successfully dated lavas from the Kalkarindi volcanic province in Australia, as well as over 2 million square kilometers or 770,000 square miles of magmatic rock located in the Northern Territory of Western Australia. Their findings attest to the fact that these lava emissions, which occurred very rapidly, took place at the same time, around 510 million years ago. These events correspond well with the mass extinction of the early Middle Cambrian. Moreover, chemical analysis of these basalts shows that they are relatively low in sulfur dioxide. However, following a major volcanic eruption, an increase in atmospheric sulfur dioxide undeniably causes a temporary cooling of the climate. Could there have been a new period of glaciation, which, although less severe than the Veringer glaciation that ended the Proterozoic eon, would have decimated much of the nascent flora and fauna? Another hypothesis is that the oceans and atmosphere were depleted of oxygen and enriched with carbon dioxide. This global greenhouse effect would have caused global warming. But how did this greenhouse effect come about? Before the Cambrian explosion, the seabed was covered with organic matter that had accumulated over time, forming a thick, dense layer. According to some scientists, the rapid appearance of Cambrian fauna disturbed the tranquil equilibrium of the seabed. The animals, then in great numbers, would have stirred up all these organic layers. By fragmenting and decomposing the organic matter in the soil, the worms and arthropods triggered a mechanism that consumed oxygen and released carbon dioxide. As a result, this explosion of life became somewhat self-sabotaging, depleting oxygen not only from the oceans, but also from the atmosphere. As a result, the anoxic waters decimated the Cambrian fauna on a massive scale, leading to the extinction of numerous species of trilobites. However, geological records show that some species managed to survive, their bodies having adapted to this low oxygen environment. Finally, an extraterrestrial cause, such as a meteorite impact or the supernova explosion of a nearby star, producing a lethally powerful gamma-ray burst, could be the ultimate explanation. In just 10 seconds, the atmospheric ozone layer would have been destroyed, no longer protecting oceanic plankton from the devastating ultraviolet rays that were at the origin of the food chains then in place. A new ice age would then have slowly set in, covering the supercontinent Gondwana at the South Pole with an immense ice cap. With sea levels lowered and ocean circulation slowed, low oxygen levels would have led to much more difficult living conditions. The Cambrian era thus came to an end with a massive biological extinction, known as the Cambrian Ordovician extinction. Brachiopods, conodonts, and trilobites were the animals that experienced the greatest reductions in species numbers. But as with every event of this kind, the surviving species take over the ecological niches left vacant. Nature shows unexpected resilience, and despite the unattractive environment, life continues to thrive. In a much calmer ocean, life returns to normal. Survivors multiply, and new species appear. At this precise moment in its evolution, planet Earth seems to be in full gestation. Will life, which first appeared in an aquatic environment, soon spread to dry land? If we can confirm that this will indeed be the case, will this spectacular evolution of species develop in the next period? For the moment, the Cambrian is giving way to the Ordovician period, a new era in which the global ocean and Earth's atmosphere cooled considerably. The Ordovician is the second period of the Paleozoic, the era that preceded that of the dinosaurs. It began 485 million years ago, just after the Cambrian-Ordovician extinction, which saw many living species abruptly disappear. Before 1879, the Ordovician was not yet recognized as a period in its own right. The Cambrian and Silurian periods followed one another. But a debate had been raging in the world scientific community for almost 40 years, as certain fossils found in the respective strata of these two periods had no proven link with them. It was Charles Lapworth, a 19th century British geologist, who finally settled the issue by interposing a new system between the other two, the Ordovician. The name of this period was borrowed from the Ordovices, a Celtic people from present-day Wales. Thanks to an in-depth study of sedimentary rock layers, he was able to demonstrate that they are far more complex than they appear. After extensive mapping work, he was able to confirm that these fossils, mainly composed of graptolites, belong to an intermediate period due to their location and arrangement in the sediments. The Ordovician period is divided into 3 eras with 7 distinct stages. From 485 to 471 million years ago, we find the Lower Ordovician, which includes the Tremodocian and Floan periods. This is followed by the Middle Ordovician, from 471 to 460 million years ago, with the Dapingian and Darawilian. The Upper Ordovician completes this period from 460 to 444 million years ago. The latter is made up of 3 stages: the Sandbian, the Catian, and finally, the Hernantian. But why, and above all, how can we divide this distant period into several parts? During the 41 million years that make up the Ordovician, certain species appeared at very specific times. It is their successive discoveries, and in particular their dating, that have made it possible to establish the chronology of these 7 stages. The oldest, the Tremodocian, is defined by the arrival of the conodont species, Leptognathus fluctivagus, now extinct. This specimen is distinguished from contemporary conodonts by the lateral orientation of its main tooth-like projections. Traces of this fossil have been found mainly on the American continent, in Kazakhstan, and in China's Hebei province. The second stage, the Floan, marks the appearance of the graptolite Tetragraptus approximatus, an easily recognized H or X-shaped filter feeder. Traces of this specimen can be found almost everywhere in the world, with the exception of the UK, Africa, and Spitsbergen, an island north of Norway. The Dapingian stage, which heralds the beginning of the Middle Ordovician, corresponds to the first date of appearance of the conodont species Baltoniatus triangularis. The next stage, the Darawilian, is marked by the appearance of the graptolite Undulagraptus ostradentatus. The Huanghuachang section near the city of Yichang, China, is recognized as the world's reference stratotype point for these 2 stages. Finally, the Upper Ordovician saw the successive emergence of the graptolite species Nemagraptus gracilis, Diplocanthograptis, caudatus, and Normalograptis, extraordinarius in the Sandbian, Cattian, and Hernantian stages. Their stratotypic reference points are in Sweden, Oklahoma, the USA, and China's Hubei province. The Ordovician has left its mark all over the globe. It allows us to establish how the continents were laid out at this time in the planet's history. Geologically speaking, the Earth changed little between the Cambrian and Ordovician periods. Land masses are still mainly located in the southern hemisphere. The northern hemisphere is still almost entirely covered by the waters of the Panthalassa Ocean. Only the continent Siberia and a small part of Laurentia have found their way into this hemisphere. The supercontinent Gondwana, partly covered by shallow seas, occupies almost the entire southern hemisphere. It includes South America, Africa, India, Australia, and Antarctica. In the intertropical zone, the three small continents that have recently formed, Laurentia, which corresponds to North America, Siberia, and Baltica, lie in the tropics. Numerous volcanic arcs are scattered around, mainly bordering the coasts of the Iapetus Ocean, and a newly formed ocean, the Reich Ocean. The opening of the latter further south between the Baltic and Gondwana initiated the closure of the Iapetus Ocean, but also the displacement of the supercontinent, which gradually moved away from the equatorial latitudes towards the South Pole. During this period, orogenic activity is very low. The mountain-building process was therefore limited to a few collisions between island arcs or ribbons of microcontinents against the south coast of the Laurentia continent. At most, a few small terrains or pieces of the Earth's crust, which detached from this megacontinent during the Lower Ordovician, will become attached to it during the Middle Ordovician. This geological phenomenon is known as the Taconian orogeny. It corresponds to a folding phase that lasted almost 10 million years before giving rise, after a long geological process, to the assembly line known today as the Appalachians. The separation of the continents reached its climax during the Middle Ordovician, the period of the Paleozoic era with the greatest number of continents. It was only much later, at the end of the Paleozoic, that they began to come together again. The Reich Ocean Ridge showed strong activity at the beginning of the Ordovician. This led to the overflow of oceans into continental surfaces. It was during the Middle Ordovician that sea levels peaked, reaching, according to some estimates, 200 meters or 650 feet above today's values. While the tropical zone is the widest of known fossil times, by the end of this period, the supercontinent Gondwana had taken root at the South Pole, where it was gradually covered by an imposing ice cap. By studying the many fossils discovered in different parts of the globe, scientists are able to conclude that major climatic variations occurred during the Ordovician period. A considerable rise in sea level, as well as the proliferation of life in marine ecosystems over a given time, corresponding to the Middle Ordovician, demonstrate that drastic climate changes took place during this period. Similarly, the sharp decline or even extinction of many species suggests that some of these changes were probably rapid, leaving little or no opportunity for existing organisms to evolve serenely. During the Ordovician period, the climate was warm and tropical, especially during the lower Ordovician, when temperatures were at their highest. Some parts of the globe experienced record temperatures close to 60 degrees Celsius or 140 degrees Fahrenheit. However, towards the end of the period, around 445 million years ago, these temperatures began to fall, leading to a major ice age. The main continent, Gondwana, was gradually covered by a massive ice cap. This glaciation, which lasted approximately 1.5 million years, triggered the disappearance of a large number of animal species that were unable to adapt to the new environmental conditions. Thus, the Ordovician is a geological period characterized by the concomitance of a major ice age and one of the 5 greatest mass extinctions in the history of our planet. Indeed, despite tropical ocean temperatures that seem to exceed 30 degrees Celsius or 86 degrees Fahrenheit, the Ordovician left numerous indirect clues to the presence of ice on the continents during this same period. In an attempt to understand the mechanisms inherent in this climate change, scientists have turned to a computerized tool. They used numerical modeling that brought together several disciplines, namely meteorology, oceanography, and environmental physics. In this way, they succeeded in resolving the climatic paradox of this period. Comparison of the numerical simulations with a wealth of sedimentological, geochemical, and micropaleontological data suggests that the first stage in the growth of an ice cap occurred as early as the Middle Ordovician, more precisely during the Darwinian stage, as evidenced by the variations in sea level, attested for the same period. These results indicate that the presence of a polar ice cap is not incompatible with high tropical ocean surface temperatures. Gradual ice growth would then have allowed the ice cap to reach tropical latitudes, marking the onset of the Hernanchian glacial maximum. In short, the Ordovician glaciation would have been a long-lasting one, of which the Hernanchian, the last stage of the Ordovician, would in fact have been only the apogee. Thanks to a relatively warm climate, the Ordovician was a very prosperous period. Life already existing, but mainly located near the seabed, multiplied in an exceptional way. This period is defined as the event of the Great Ordovician biodiversification. During this relatively short period of only 25 million years, the oceans were truly filled with numerous families and genera of living organisms. There are many reasons for this unprecedented expansion of marine life. However, a key factor has been the increase in the surface area of continental shelves, particularly in the tropics, as well as high sea levels, all of which have encouraged the growth of phytoplankton, and consequently, of all aquatic organisms. These microorganisms have proliferated in the epicontinental seas, which are particularly extensive. Thanks to the abundance of phytoplankton, several groups of zooplankton made their appearance before expanding exponentially. These include chitanozoans and graptolites. In addition, constant volcanic and tectonic activity during the Ordovician period most likely provided the nutrients required for the development of planktonic life in the oceans. As a result, the water column gradually filled with all kinds of living microorganisms, but not only. Indeed, the first fish made their appearance at this time, and cephalopods, the ancestors of octopus and cuttlefish, diversified like never before, to the point where, by the end of the Ordovician, ecosystems comparable to those of today already existed. This period marks the biodiversity plateau of the Paleozoic. Life became so abundant in the oceans that it eventually began to spread on land too. Fossils of spores, the microorganisms that form part of the life cycle of many bacteria, plants, algae, fungi, and even some protozoa, have been found in sediments attributed to the Upper Ordovician period. Similar to contemporary liverworts, these first land plants were most likely descended from green algae, already widespread during the Cambrian, the preceding period. Their proliferation was confined to shorelines and coastlines, where they formed a low-growing carpet. Among the fossils studied from the same period, others revealed the presence of the first terrestrial fungi. They certainly played a major role in the colonization of emergent soils by flora, making mineral nutrients available to plant cells through mycorrhizal symbiosis. Although these discrete plants are fairly primitive and basic, they mark a decisive turning point in the evolution of life on Earth. And while this stage is still in its infancy, it is no less important. It's the first time on the planet, after bacteria and other microorganisms, that a form of life is actually visible on unsubmerged soil. Thus, during the Ordovician period, the hues that brightened up the ocean floor began to timidly color dry land. Although this transitional period is decisive in our planet's geological history, it has long been overlooked. Indeed, until the early 2000s, only two major lagerstätten, i.e. sedimentary deposits containing a wide variety of fossils, testifying to the Ordovician period, had been recorded. The first is located in New York State, USA. This is Beecher's trilobite bed, located in the Frankfurt Shale at Cleveland's Glen. It is associated with very particular environments, namely deep hydrothermal springs, in which low-diversity faunas dominated by a few arthropods thrived. Only 3 to 4 centimeters or 2 inches thick, this lagerstätten revealed numerous trilobites in an exceptional state of preservation, particularly of their ventral anatomy and soft tissues, the latter preserved by pyrite replacement. This mineral, which is an iron sulfide, allows X-rays to be used to study the finest details of soft tissue anatomy. The fauna of this site is largely composed of the trilobite, Triarthris atoni. It alone accounts for 85% of the organisms studied. Other species include graptolites, colonial filter feeders, branched algae, brachiopods, and other enigmatic taxa. Among the many trilobite specimens of Cryptolithus, Bellulus, Cornoproteus beecheri, and Primaspis crocetus have also been inventoried. In terms of population, It belongs to the penultimate stage of the Upper Ordovician, the Cattian. The second proven lagerstätten from the Ordovician to the 2000s was discovered in South Africa. This is the Soom Shale. It reflects the population of the Hernantian, the very last period of the Ordovician. Only the remains of pelagic organisms, i.e., those living in the water column, have been discovered here, thanks to their good state of preservation. These include arthropods, cephalopods, conodonts, and agnathan fish. However, these two conservation sites, like others, are far from providing as much information as those collected for the previous period, the Cambrian. All the more so as they provide new elements that only concern the end of the Ordovician. Nevertheless, as fossils are discovered, they continue to advance our understanding of this period. At the very beginning of the 21st century, in a valley in southern Morocco, north of Zagora, a major paleontological discovery revolutionized scientists' understanding of the earliest animal diversifications of the early Phanerozoic. This is the lagerstätten Les Phasota. The importance of the treasures delivered in this area even gives it the honor of being named by some the Ordovician Burgess Shale of Morocco. This storage site is an exceptionally well-preserved Ordovician deposit, but more importantly, it has yielded abundant and, last but not least, highly diversified marine faunas, some of which are attributed to the lower Ordovician. It has been selected as one of the 100 most important geological sites in the world because of its role in understanding Ordovician evolution. What makes the Phasota site so remarkable is its predominantly clay formation, dating from the Tremodocian, the very first stage of the Ordovician. This clay deposit, estimated to have lasted almost 2 million years, contains a wide variety of fossils, making it possible to study the paleofauna. Fossils of carapace animals, similar to those found in the Burgess Shale dating from the Cambrian, have been discovered in the Phasota clays. These have come as a surprise to paleontologists, who previously believed that this fauna had disappeared during the Middle Cambrian, some 40 million years before the Phasota clays were deposited. This paleofauna also reveals crown group taxa, whose presence was unknown in the lower Ordovician. While the Phasota fauna is dominated by trilobites, it also contains a high abundance of xiphosurid arthropods, paleoscolicid worms, annelids, mollusks, brachiopods, and condylar worms. Graptolites are also abundant. More recently, excavations at Tayshout, some 80 kilometers or 50 miles from the Phasota site, have uncovered a new fossiliferous site. It differs from the Phasota site in several respects. Firstly, it is a few million years younger. But above all, this site, which was once underwater, has preserved traces of large arthropods, described as giants. These, which may be related to modern creatures such as shrimps, insects, or spiders, must have been able to swim freely and move in currents. These organisms are in the minority in the Phasota area. Given their colossal size, we imagine that they almost certainly dominated the seas 470 million years ago. Some specimens could measure up to 2 meters in length. They are therefore much larger than any specimens discovered to date. These giant arthropods, although not yet fully identified, may belong to species already discovered on the Fuzuta coast. Their large size and free-swimming lifestyle suggest that they must have played a unique role in Ordovician ecosystems. If paleontologists can study mineral elements, they can also observe with precision the soft parts, which are in an exceptional state of preservation. At last, scientists are able to study the anatomy of the first animals the Earth ever sheltered. The carcasses discovered are thought to have come from a relatively deep marine environment, which is completely different from previous discoveries, where carcasses were preserved in shallow places. In addition, animals such as brachiopods were found attached to some fragments of these giant arthropods. This suggests that these large animals, once dead, served as nutrient reserves for seabed communities. The remains of Teichut's fossilized organs enable scientists to map the marine environment of the early Ordovician period with some precision. The Ordovician remains a largely unknown period, yet it was a pivotal moment for the evolution of the brachiopod to attach itself to the seabed. Brachiopods are protostomans, one of 2 existing groups of bilaterians, along with bryozoans. Bryozoans are mossy animals that live in colonies. They take a variety of forms, including arborescence or lace fan. Although they strangely resemble corals, they are not corals. Each individual secretes an arborescent calcium carbonate skeleton attached to a hard surface. Each specimen, called a zooid, usually measures less than 1 millimeter in length and lives in its own little lodge. All interconnected, they form colonies containing millions of zooids, which can grow to several meters in size. Within the same colony, each individual plays a distinct role. Some gather food, others help to strengthen the group. Finally, some of these individuals contribute to cleaning. To feed, bryozoans create a water current that brings tiny creatures to their mouths. Most of the time, these are plant-like organisms such as phytoplankton. Bryozoans gradually colonize certain areas of the seabed, eventually building up into extensive reefs. Trilobites make up a large part of the Ordovician fauna. These crustaceans, which secreted an easily identifiable segmented exoskeleton, reached their peak during the Ordovician. In fact, they are the most famous prehistoric animals after the dinosaurs. Over 18,000 species have been recorded. They ranged in size from 1 to 70 centimeters or 0.3 to 30 inches in length. And their way of life covered the whole range of thalassic environments. Some were detritus feeders, grazers, or even predators. While a few species mastered swimming, the majority of trilobites moved along the seabed, burrowing into the sediment to escape predators. Trilobites also developed the first advanced visual system. All trilobites had a head, called the cephalon, a thorax and a tail, as well as pairs of biramid legs on the ventral side. As with crustaceans, these legs had 2 branches, one serving as a gill for respiration, the other for locomotion and feeding. Among the most common trilobites, Cryptolithus measured around 1.5 centimeters or 0.6 inches in length. and Acadaspis nearly 2 centimeters or 0.8 inches. But there were also specimens of far more spectacular dimensions. These included the calamine, between 2 and 5 centimeters or up to 2 inches, and above all, the Isoletus, which could commonly reach 38 centimeters or 15 inches in length. However, the world's largest trilobite species ever discovered is Isoletus rex. Its complete fossil measures no less than 72 centimeters or 28 inches long, and 40 centimeters or 16 inches wide. The seabed was also covered by a large population of arthropods. Eurypterids, or gigantostracans, are one of the many species. They are also known as sea scorpions, for their shape is similar to that of modern-day scorpions. Eurypterids have elongated bodies extended by a long articulated tail. Its thorax is equipped with fearsome pincers, and its head features several pairs of eyes. A pair of legs that were intended to act as fins is terminated by large swimming paddles. Finally, most species are equipped with a tapering string at the end of the tail, which may well have served, if not to inject venom into some prey, to lacerate it. The size of Eurypterids was highly variable and probably depended on environmental factors, lifestyle, and taxonomic affinities. While the majority of arthropods were small-bodied and probably scavengers, the Eurypterid was undoubtedly one of the most feared predators of the Paleolithic oceans, commonly measuring a meter in length. Some of these specimens grew to over 2 meters or 7 feet in length. Megalograptus is another arthropod species. It is the oldest known Eurypterid. Of good size, the largest of the specimens discovered measures 78 centimeters or 31 inches in length. Like its congeners, it has spikes on its third pair of legs. Large spines on its various appendages helped it to locate prey, hidden in soft sediments and out of sight. Its telson, the last segment of its tail, if not venomous, probably helped it to tear its victims apart when feeding. During the Ordovician period, many new forms of echinoderms appeared, including sea stars, sea urchins, and crinoids. At that time, there were some 20 classes. While all present-day echinoderms have a pentarad configuration, i.e. 5 rays, this wasn't always the case for primitive forms, such as the carpoid, a strange specimen that still holds many secrets. Its truncated tail turns out to be a single arm at one end of its body. The animal's mouth is concealed on its underside. This single arm was probably as much for moving around on the seabed as for feeding. Given its morphology, it was probably a detritivore. The Ordovician period is also marked by the presence of large numbers of graptolites. These animals, living in colonies of 3 to several thousand individuals, belong to the Hemichordae phylum. They resemble coral polyps, made up of coiled toothed tubes, and are gathered around a main stem, on which small cells shelter each individual specimen. These colonies of animals, floating or attached as the case may be, measure from 10 millimeters to almost a meter in length. The names of the different graptolite genera refer to the appearance of their branches and their number. Monograptus, for example, has a single linear branch, while Didymograptus and Tetragrammatus have 2 and 4 respectively. Spirograptus has a single spiral branch. Cephalopods are the dominant predators. Cephalopods lived in front of a long shell, called a chambered shell, because it was made up of several partition cavities. While some, like ammonites, had spiral shells, others were classified as orthoconic cephalopods. As their name suggests, they had a straight shell. This could be extremely large, reaching up to 6 meters or 20 feet in length, in the case of Camarasaurus. Another species, Cryptoceras, was usually around a meter long. Cephalopods were formidable predators, moving at will through the water column. It controlled its buoyancy by varying the amount of air in the various chambers of its shell. It was able to move by reaction, forcefully expelling the air contained in its body. Like a squid with a protective shell, this predator was at the top of the food chain. Thanks to its strong tentacles, it could dexterously capture any coveted prey, especially the trilobites that lived in great numbers on the sediments. All he had to do was carry his trophies to his mouth. This beak-shaped mouth was located in the center of the tentacles. In modern cephalopod groups, this shell has since shrunk considerably, or even disappeared altogether. Today, for those specimens that still have it, it is no more than a relatively small internal structure. Modern cephalopods include squid, octopus, nautilus, and cuttlefish. To feed all these little creatures, numerous mollusks line the seabed. Among them is the group of pelecypods, or bivalves. This group includes clams, scallops, oysters, and mussels. These filter feeders, which form shellfish beds, have 2 identically shaped valves on each of their body, and a laterally compressed burrowing foot. The upper edge of each shell usually has several teeth and sockets that fit into those of the opposite shell to form a hinge. Other mollusks also lived in large numbers on the seabed, gastropods. Snails and slugs also played an important role in this biodiversity. Unlike snails, slugs do not secrete shells, but they do have the same internal organs: a heart, a digestive system, gills, and a nervous system. Snails can be recognized by their unique coiled or spiral outer shell. The shell offered refuge from threats, which must have been incessant. The Ordovician seabed was also littered with corals, each more colorful than the last. Some were horn-shaped and secreted an exoskeleton that could grow up to 1 meter or 3 feet long, such as the Rugosa coral. Although this coral could be solitary, it could also form large colonies by grouping together with many of its companions. Like all corals, these are much more than just a stony skeleton. Inside, animals in the form of seeded polyps are evolving, as is their framework, which adapts to their growth. Equipped with tentacles containing stinging cells, they were able to capture their prey in suspension. While most corals captured and devoured their prey, they drew most of their energy from algae. Numerous varieties of round tabulate corals also carpeted the ocean floor, covered by warm, shallow waters. But the most extraordinary species is undoubtedly the crinoids. These marine animals gave their environment the appearance of a spring meadow. Indeed, they are commonly referred to as sea lilies. Belonging to the phylum Echinodermata, which also includes sea stars, sea cucumbers, and sea urchins, they display the pentarad symmetry typical of echinoderms. Attached to the seabed by a long pedicle that can reach up to several dozen meters, they look more like flowers. Yet they were actually animals that fed with the help of podia, hollow cylindrical organs on their delicate arms that resembled the lightness of feathers. Food particles suspended in the ocean currents were captured by these arms before being placed in a furrow running through them. Then, like pistols, tiny cilia carried the trapped particles to the mouth at the center of the head. Among the invertebrates inhabiting the Paleolithic seabed, there are also those belonging to the sponge group. They played an extremely important role during the Ordovician period as reef-building organisms. Stromatoporoids are sponges calcified in layers called lamellae. Between each of these plates are vertical structures called pillars, as well as small distinct chambers called galleries. These galleries are lined with choanocytes, which serve to capture food and breathe while water circulates between the layers. Bumps are visible on the surface. These are nipples that probably contributed to the absorption and flow of water through this architecture. As fossils testify, stromatoporoids coexisted during the Ordovician period with many other species such as mollusks and brachiopods. Some shell organisms may even have been completely enveloped by a growing stromatoporoid, with some reaching 30 centimeters or 12 inches in diameter. However, these two species cohabited in harmony, with water flowing from one end of the stromatoporoid's porous structure to the other. Another sponge, with a very distinctive shape, also dominates the seabed. This is Brachiospongia digitata, a glass sponge. This siliceous sponge has a skeleton made up of a network of opaline siliceous spicules. Its cup-shaped structure features a series of 6 to 12 curved finger-like extensions. Finally, there's the Aulacera plumeri. This elongated organism resembles a trunk. Some of its specimens have probably reached 5 meters in height. We can imagine these animals living in colonies, giving the seabed the appearance of a more or less dense winter forest, through which prey and predators had to thread their way or even chase each other. Finally, the first vertebrates visible during the Ordovician period were agnathans. These fish are still the first vertebrates to appear on the planet. They are organisms that lack jaws and mandibles. Their mouths were slit-shaped, round as in the modern lamprey and hagfish, the only survivors from this period. Most agnathans had a cartilage skeleton and at least 7 gill pouches. These fish lacked paired fins and a stomach, but had a pineal eye, which was particularly sensitive to light. Agnathans could measure up to 30 centimeters in length. The plant world also underwent a number of diversifications during the Ordovician period. Encrusting calcareous algae, green algae, and brown algae multiplied and diversified, to the detriment of cyanobacteria. Although cyanobacteria played an essential building role in reefs, they were gradually supplanted by corals and bryozoans. From the Middle Ordovician onwards, more precisely, During the Darwinian period that stretches from 467 to 458 million years ago, the fauna underwent great diversification. While no new phyla appeared, the number of families quadrupled and the number of genera tripled. Pelagic animals were far more abundant than in the previous period, giving the seas the appearance they would retain throughout the Paleozoic. This vast diversification is probably explained by the drop in ocean temperatures, which were quite high at the beginning of the Ordovician, exceeding 45 degrees Celsius at the time. Indeed, temperatures gradually decreased until the Darwinian, when seas were comparable to today's equatorial seas, with waters around 30 degrees Celsius. Conditions for the development of life had then become particularly favorable, hence this great diversification. In addition, oceanic waters were enriched in mineral salts by the intense activity of ridges and by continental erosion, accentuated by the growth of terrestrial plants, especially as a large part of the continents was covered by shallow waters. These conditions favored the development of phytoplankton and algae attached to the ocean floor. As a result, food chains were literally boosted, encouraging the diversification of filter feeders, grazers, and primary consumers of all kinds, and then, de facto, that of predators. By the end of the Ordovician period, a quarter of all marine animal families and half of all marine animal genera had disappeared. This was the first great extinction of life, better known as the Ordovician crisis. But what could have happened on the planet to bring it to this point? According to scientists, the disappearance of more than 70% of all species is due to an immense episode of glaciation that the Earth underwent. According to some researchers, this biological crisis can be broken down into two extinction phases, spanning some 1 million years. A climatic cooling, triggered by continental drift, would have led to a drop in ocean temperature. Then, induced glaciation would have led to the formation of an ice cap, extending as far south as the high latitudes. Cold, oxygen-rich water would then have spread to areas previously poor in oxygen, causing the disappearance of organisms adapted to anoxic conditions. As ice expansion led to lower sea levels, oceans would have lost large quantities of water. As a result, organisms living in shallow waters would have suffered greatly. Then, at the end of this period of glaciation, rising sea levels would have triggered an expansion of the waters, this time warm and poorly oxygenated, leading to further extinctions. Another hypothesis challenges this explanation and suggests that this first of 5 Phanerozoic mass extinctions could be attributed to volcanic eruptions. Volcanoes are known to emit mercury. However, mercury enrichment of sediments has already been observed in other, more recent biological crises on the planet. A team of researchers therefore analyzed sediments located in China's Hubei province, where the Wengejiawan Cut, a Hernanchian stratotype, is found. During the Ordovician, this region belonged to the Yangtze Block, then covered by the sea. Black clays rich in graptolite fossils were deposited in an anoxic environment. Then, as the sea level dropped and the water cooled, clayey limestone covered these clays. The latter contains fossils of the Hernanchia fauna, characteristic of this ice age. The subsequent clays represent the post-glacial rise in sea level. However, it turns out that mercury enrichment was measured just before the clay limestone was deposited and persisted throughout the glaciation. A second enrichment occurred immediately before the arrival of the post-glacial clays. Similar observations were made in Nevada, when this territory belonged to an isolated continent, the Laurentia continent. Scientists have deduced that these mercury emissions correspond to peaks in volcanic activity. These two peaks of activity coincide with the two extinction phases of the Ordovician period. Researchers therefore hypothesize that eruptions attributed to supervolcanoes would have released gigantic quantities of carbon dioxide and methane, leading inexorably to a drop in Earth temperatures and the development of polar ice caps. For other paleontologists, the ice age that the Earth experienced around 460 million years ago could have been caused by a much more extraordinary phenomenon, one that is extraterrestrial in nature. In other words, winter came from the cosmos. A first hypothesis mentions a violent collision between two asteroids. The collision would have occurred in the asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter, and its unprecedented violence would have shattered the larger of the two objects, which were over 150 kilometers or 93 miles wide, into billions of pieces. According to this hypothesis, the numerous fragments, some no larger than dust, others several tens of kilometers or miles in size, then began to orbit the Sun. The trajectory of the smaller debris changed and it gradually moved closer to our star, and consequently to Earth. 10,000 years after this extraordinary collision, the dust began to penetrate the Earth's atmosphere and scatter all around our planet. The result was a shower of fine particles that lasted for almost 2 million years. But after these tiny pieces of debris, larger and larger rocks similarly deviated from their orbits, impacted the Earth. By analyzing numerous asteroid fragments in Ordovician rocks, scientists were able to date this event back 466 million years. In fact, the quantity of extraterrestrial dust is 1,000 to 10,000 times greater than in the sediment layers below this period. If debris from outer space regularly falls to Earth, the colossal quantities that reached it at that time cannot have been without consequence, and with good reason. Through this curtain of dust, the sun's rays had difficulty reaching the planet. Temperatures dropped considerably. Snow appeared at the South Pole and fell without interruption. As it accumulates, it gradually turns to ice. The South Pole is gradually covered by an ice cap, trapping a significant quantity of our planet's water. As a result, ocean levels dropped and winter set in on the planet. This winter will continue for millions of years. However, not all scientists agree with this theory, for while it is undeniable that an ice cap did indeed form at the South Pole between 467 and 458 million years ago, or even earlier, temperatures had already begun to fall by the beginning of the Ordovician period. What's more, for many experts, a veil of dust from outer space could not have influenced climate over such a long period. Other mechanisms probably contributed to this drop in temperature. What if the continental waltz had something to do with it? During the Ordovician period, 3 small continents drifted away from the megacontinent Gondwana. While the latter remained at the height of the South Pole, the smaller continents moved closer to the equator. Laurentia, Siberia, and Baltica therefore enjoy a tropical climate. The sun's scorching rays alternate with unparalleled precipitation. The carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is then precipitated by rainwater onto the continents or directly into the oceans. Under the effect of this heat and abundant rainfall, rocks are dissolved. They are then eroded by the ions released by this dissolution. Some of these ions contain carbon, which is also carried by runoff into the oceans, where marine organisms use it to build their shells and skeletons. Carbon dioxide is inevitably reduced in the atmosphere, so it no longer fulfills its greenhouse function. As terrestrial temperatures depend directly on the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, if the latter falls, so do temperatures. So, for some scientists, the cooling of the planet during the Ordovician period is explained by plate tectonics. Finally, another theory, albeit controversial, could explain this mass extinction. This is linked to the supernova explosion of a dying star, several thousand light-years from Earth. This explosion, which seems to have taken place over 440 million years ago, in the farthest reaches of our galaxy, generated powerful radiation energy, releasing an extraordinary quantity of gamma rays. After a long journey at the speed of light, these unfortunately hit the blue planet after piercing the atmosphere with unprecedented power. The impact was so violent that it annihilated the air molecules and swept away the atmosphere surrounding our planet. One of the first consequences was a chemical change in the atmosphere. Nitrogen and oxygen molecules were transformed into nitrogen dioxide. This brownish, particularly noxious gas eventually surrounded the planet. The planet was then no longer able to receive sunlight, causing temperatures to plummet. But let's put this into context and look at the various phases of this extinction, which have been extensively documented in a 2010 TV documentary. Before this supernova, life teems in the oceans. The sun was shining brightly under a radiant sky, and species were multiplying on a massive scale in tropical seas. For the first time on the planet, which is warm and humid, life seems to be gaining ground. Some species are even beginning to venture out of the water, particularly in the shallow, epicontinental seas. It's true that on the surface, paradoxically, life is hardly possible, and our world looks more like a wasteland, like Venus, for example. Oxygen levels are so low that no modern animal could breathe properly. Imagine the silence that must have reigned on the planet at that time. Absolute silence. But this Olympian calm is about to be disturbed by the supernova explosion of a dying star 6,000 light-years from Earth. Powerful radiation bursts from its poles. It's a gamma-ray explosion, the most violent phenomenon in the cosmos. In just 10 seconds, this supernova produces more energy than 1,000 suns put together. These gamma rays then travel through space at the speed of light. Despite its remoteness, planet Earth will unfortunately not be spared. But luckily, the cataclysm occurred far enough away that it didn't blow away our atmosphere and send it into the cosmos. Gamma rays are therefore able to penetrate the upper layer of the atmosphere. Like the northern lights, they produce a spectacle of rare beauty, but their impact will be decisive and, above all, destructive. Within seconds of the supernova, these lethal rays annihilate air molecules and blow away the atmosphere. A star of strange behavior stands not far from our Sun, visible even in broad daylight. These are the remnants of the supernova, which will remain visible for a few more months before disappearing completely. At first glance, this distant cataclysm seems to have had little impact on life on Earth, and yet, in the hours that followed, extinction did indeed begin, but at a microscopic level. During their passage, the gamma rays destroyed 30% of the ozone layer, allowing the sun's ultraviolet rays to reach the planet. The light is so bright that it appears 50 times more intense than in the middle of the Sahara Desert. If terrestrial creatures had existed at this time, they would literally have been consumed in a very short time. The consequences of this biological disaster will begin to show in the water. Plankton, invisible to the naked eye, are the first to suffer. The sun's rays, which have become too powerful, burn off the vast majority of these microorganisms. Plankton is the basis of the food chain. Imagine the panic of plankton eaters as they watch their food run out under the devastating sun. Trilobites, whose larvae's main incubation site is the water's surface, see their reproduction diminish and even come to a halt. Nothing can survive the intensity of the sun's rays. Many corals and other animals quickly perish. A veritable domino effect leads to the collapse of the entire food chain. Tropical zones are the first to be affected by this particularly harmful ultraviolet radiation, and coral reefs are gradually dying out. Soon this phenomenon spread to the four corners of the globe, with corals succumbing to starvation. More and more animal species run out of food, and the reefs die out week after week. In the months that follow, the weakest animals are the first to disappear. For some, driven by their survival instinct, eating habits change. Predators accustomed to choosing their food must now make do with what they are lucky enough to find. Some even start eating corpses, something they would never have done before. Some species will eventually leave the dying reefs in search of food. This is particularly true of the giant orthoceras, the squid's ancestors, who have preferred to venture into brackish waters to devour new prey, the eurypterids. Famine rages. It affected all species, causing more and more extinctions. Biodiversity underwent an unprecedented crisis. If all the creatures in existence at the time had disappeared, what would have become of our planet? Would life have evolved in a completely different way? More on this later. In the months that followed, the scattered molecules of the atmosphere swirled around the Earth's sphere. As the atoms line up, they form nitrogen dioxide, a brownish, noxious gas. The bright sunlight is gradually masked by this thick layer of putrid air. After suffering the sun's wrath, the planet now receives only 50% of the sun's rays. Inevitably, the temperature drops to -12 degrees Celsius or 10 degrees Fahrenheit. Species that have survived famine until now are now faced with temperatures that are far too low. Nautiloids in particular are seeing their eggs laid a few months earlier fail to develop properly. The cold has slowed embryonic growth, encouraging the appearance of bacteria. The rare specimens that survive this compromised incubation enter a world of chaos. During their short life, they have only one objective: to find food. But these mollusks have a distinct advantage over many other species. Their bodies are totally protected by a shell that has enabled them to live in deep waters, sheltering from the devastating effects of climatic cooling. What's more, they have a varied diet. They are sometimes even labeled as opportunists and have never hesitated to be scavengers. Animals that were able to move around, therefore, tried to reach milder areas. Unfortunately, during the Ordovician period, the majority of animals were sedentary, and the seabed was largely occupied by corals, brachiopods, sponges, and many other non-mobile species. Another problem associated with the lack of food is shell formation. The shells of most reef dwellers are made of calcium carbonate. Calcium carbonate is extremely difficult to secrete in cold water, which has inevitably led to the disappearance of many species. The planet's cooling has also resulted in a harsh and, above all, unpredictable climate. Before the supernova, the weather was always very stable. But for the first time in millions of years, major temperature shifts are triggering strong ocean currents. These generated violent climatic disturbances. The planet, hitherto relatively peaceful, is confronted with a Category 5 hurricane that sweeps across its surface on a permanent basis. Many animals, too weak to resist, end up smashed against the rocks. Those still able to fight try to find refuge in the depths, away from the surface waters, which are far too turbulent for them. But not everyone can escape the pressure of deep water. This is also the case for orthoceras, which, despite their titanic size, cannot find shelter there. Their disproportionately long shells are not designed to withstand such pressure. As a result, even the largest predator known to Ordovician times found itself in an awkward position. Nautiloids, on the other hand, thanks to their more robust shells, were able to find refuge in deeper, less turbulent waters during these storms. For dozens, even hundreds of years, these species suffered heavy losses. Corpses by the thousands washed ashore. More than 500 years after this event, from outer space, almost a third of the fauna became extinct, and the remaining creatures had little chance of surviving in these conditions. Life on Earth, in whatever form, was threatened with complete extinction. However, a certain number of individuals would survive and make it through the following thousands of years. Nearly 150,000 years later, life on Earth was virtually reduced to nothing. The species that survive this biological catastrophe are constantly starving. Orthoceras, once lords of the seas, are now weakened scavengers in a world that no longer resembles what it once was, especially as a new ice age begins. The planet is getting colder and colder, and snow is piling up at the South Pole, until over the centuries it has become so dense as to form immense glaciers, several kilometers or miles thick. These run along the length of the Gondwanaland continent, spreading further and further north. These glaciers trap a huge quantity of water, so much so that sea levels drop considerably, losing up to 60 meters or 200 feet. As a result, the shoals dry up completely, squeezing the life out of the few remaining communities. This drying up proves even more fatal than the gamma ray explosion itself. Some animals showed great resilience during this new ice age, in particular the Astrapus, the ancestor of all vertebrates. The first known vertebrate fish, this jawless agnathan, was able to follow the retreating ocean. Measuring around 10 centimeters or 4 inches in length and equipped with large external bony plates serving as a shield, it withstood cold water better than any other aquatic creature. What's more, since its diet was not exclusive, it fed on whatever it could find. Carnivores, on the other hand, which fed strictly on a specific prey, found it much more difficult to feed, and many of these species became extinct. What's more, Astrapus didn't just adapt to its environment. In fact, a new variety of fish soon appeared. These now have bones and muscles that give rise to the first gills, making it easier to sort and absorb food. In this totally transformed world, Astrapus was not the only fish to follow the movement of the oceans. The Eurypterid, commonly known as the sea scorpion, also changed its territory, fleeing from the surface. It has even taken the place of the Orthoceras in the food chain, its main rival, which did not survive these extreme conditions. Since Astrapus was half its size, its need for food was much lower, a much more favorable factor for its survival. During this ice age, the planet took on a completely different aspect. Falling sea levels reveal new landscapes. The reefs created by sponges, corals, and arthropods were reduced to skeletons and partly emerged. The rare species that survived these reefs did not survive the cooling, especially as glaciers gradually invaded the subtropics. Gigantic icebergs drift through these former tropical regions, crushing everything in their path, including coral, thousands of years old. Year after year, sea levels continue to fall. Life is hanging on by a thread, but those still alive are struggling to keep up with the oceans, while aquatic habitats are becoming ever smaller. Unfortunately, the cascading consequences of the supernova are not yet over. Soon, the survivors will have to face a new climatic event, as more than 500,000 years after the start of this crisis, the planet is showing signs of warming. Glaciers are beginning to melt. Species that managed to adapt to this ice age will once again have to acclimatize to these new temperatures to stay alive. Some species stand out by adopting unprecedented behaviors. The Eurypterid is the best example. This sea scorpion, now the world's largest predator, began carrying the carcasses of its prey towards the shore. It even ventured onto land, as evidenced by the development of lungs found on certain specimens. Astrapus's cousins, the acanthodians, have also developed jaws. They are no longer content to eat algae. These scavengers can now cut flesh and feed more easily. In this way, they moved up the food chain. In the course of this long adaptation, the roles were reversed. Predators became prey and vice versa. But no matter, life, fragile as it may seem, has endured. More than 3 million years after this extinction, it's time to take stock. And it's a heavy one. over 70% of species have become extinct. According to scientists, nearly 1 million species existed before this mass extinction. This means that around 700,000 of them died out in this relatively short period on a global scale. All living organisms were impacted, bottom dwellers and pelagics alike. Yet its impact on the history of the living world was not so catastrophic, insofar as this biological crisis did not result in the total disappearance of any major animal group. Life proved to be extraordinarily resilient, beyond all expectations. At the end of this period, the Earth will gradually return to a tropical climate, giving the various animal and plant species a little respite. But will this respite be long enough to allow new biodiversification? I think you already know the answer. The name of this geological era comes from the Celtic tribe of Silurians who lived in South Wales, where traces of this period were discovered. As mentioned in the introduction, the Silurian is a small period spanning some 25 million years. It began around 443 million years ago and ended around 418 million years ago. This period, the third stage of the Paleozoic, is itself subdivided into 4 series, marked by different events that geologists have defined as follows. The first, called Landovery, or Landoverian, begins 443 million years ago and ends around 433, followed by the Wenlock, or Wenlockian, until 427, then Ludlow, or Ludlowian, until 423, and finally, the Predoli, or Predolian, closes the period between 423 and 419 or 416 million years ago, depending on estimates. As you can see from this reproduction of the image of the Earth in Silurian times, the continents Laurentia, Baltica, and Siberia are still isolated from each other. They formed a gigantic archipelago, so to speak. They were close to the supercontinent known as Proto-Gondwana. Gradually, however, the 3 continents moved closer together. This process would continue throughout the Silurian to give rise to the future supercontinent Laurasia. On land and at sea, nothing on our planet ever stands still. Everything is in perpetual motion. Change is continuous, and yet we never notice it. It has to be said that change is so slow and takes place over millions of years that it is imperceptible. Yet the upheavals, be they geological, climatic, organic, or evolutionary, are there for all to see. The dance of the continents continues, as you can see. This coming together of the continents will also give rise to a new mountain range, the Caledonian Chain. At the very beginning of this era, the Iapetus Ocean continued to subduct, i.e., an oceanic lithospheric plate slipped beneath an adjacent plate that was advancing in the opposite direction. On the edge of the Laurentia continent, a geological and geographical difference from the Ordovician can be observed. Towards the end of the Ordovician period, a terrane, or microcontinent, slowly detached from Gondwana and clung, so to speak, to the Laurentia continent. Speaking of Gondwana, have you noticed the ice cap that has settled over the continent? As the climate evolves, this will retreat. As a logical consequence, sea levels rose. Glacial sediments from this period can be found as far away as the Wenlock. Over time, a warmer climate sets in. Sea levels are higher and temperatures milder. All these phenomena had an impact on Silurian flora and fauna. But the big divide between the Ordovician and Silurian periods was the biological crisis that hit our planet so hard, a mass extinction that will lead a large number of species to their doom. The Ordovician period was an aquatic paradise for all species living on our planet. Biodiversity was rich and species thrived and adapted perfectly to their environment. Remember, we spoke in the introduction about a major evolutionary radiation during the Ordovician period. Marine species multiplied by a factor of 4. Nautiloids, cephalopod mollusks, and the first coral reefs appeared. This was followed by the biological crisis of the Ordovician Silurian, which is thought to have broken down into 2 extinction phases, separated from each other by an ice age. Indeed, traces of an ice cap have been found extending over what were then the high southern latitudes. During this glacial period, perhaps as a direct consequence of continental drift, cold, oxygen-rich water would have spread into areas that had previously been poorly oxygenated. In addition, this glaciation would have led to a drop in sea level of around 100 meters. This increase in land area, due to lower sea levels, will affect the lush fauna of the continental shelves, i.e. the shallow waters bordering the continents and extending into the open sea to within a few hundred kilometers of the coastline. As the ice expands, it withdraws large quantities of water from the oceans, causing a drop in sea level that can be considerable, as was undoubtedly the case at the time. Living organisms adapted to anoxia, i.e. to an environment that was ultimately rather low in oxygen, would not have been able to withstand this change, causing their extinction. This period of glaciation eventually came to an end and is thought to have lasted between 1 and 2 million years. It's important to point out that although glaciation was a major cause of the extinction, other factors such as changes in sea level, plate tectonics, and variations in atmospheric CO2 concentration also played a role. The end of the Ice Age is not without consequences. Rising sea levels would have caused the expansion of poorly oxygenated warm waters, leading to further extinctions. If this hypothesis is correct, it could explain why the biological crisis affected bottom-dwelling organisms such as brachiopods, echinoderms, and trilobites, as well as pelagic forms such as graptolites and nautiloids. While the biological crisis is significant, scientists estimate that it affected almost 85% of species, it did not extinguish large groups in their entirety. A few specimens persist and manage to survive despite these changes in their respective biotopes. In fact, we're going to meet a number of them on our Silurian journey. Some species and genera have undergone evolutionary radiation, enabling them to pass the Ordovician stage. Before going any further, I think it's important to make a brief aside about mass extinctions. Biological crises such as the Ordovician Silurian have occurred several times in Earth's history. Some are better known than others, such as the Cretaceous extinction of the dinosaurs, but they are far from the only ones. Life underwent 5 mass extinctions during the Phanerozoic, the eon that stretches from the beginning of the Cambrian, 541 million years ago, to the present day. The 2 most important crises divide this eon into 3 eras: the Paleozoic, the Mesozoic, and the Cenozoic. Two mass extinctions occurred during the Paleozoic, at the end of the Ordovician, as just mentioned, and at the end of the Devonian. Contrary to what we sometimes hear, these crises were never brutal. They very often had multiple and combined origins, and these were spread over millions of years. When we talk about mass extinctions, we're talking about major crises. These are the ones we're generally most familiar with, because they have, of course, left their mark on the history of our planet. But that doesn't mean they're the only ones to have occurred. The history of living organisms has been punctuated by less severe crises. In fact, the Silurian had 3 minor extinctions that can be observed in the ocean. There was the so-called Erevakian crisis 433 million years ago, at the boundary between Llandovery and Wenlock, the Mold crisis at the beginning of the Ludlow, and the Lau crisis towards the end of the same period. For the first, scientists believed that the sea was anoxic, i.e., that the concentration of oxygen in the water dropped sharply. For the others, it's the ocean level that's mainly to blame. In 30,000 years, sea level would have risen by 16 meters. This is a very rapid change. Too rapid to give the species dependent on the impacted biotopes time to adapt and evolve accordingly. To conclude the chapter on geology and geography in the Silurian era, the most important thing to remember is that the Earth underwent considerable changes, notably the melting of the great ice formations, which had major repercussions on the environment and life. These repercussions are sometimes an unavoidable shock for the living world, but are also sometimes synonymous with renewal, diversity, and development. Fauna underwent a great upheaval following the mass extinction at the end of the Ordovician period. It was even fatal for a large number of species. However, other species managed to survive the extinction. This is the case for certain species, such as certain members of the trilobites. After the major biological crisis that hit our oceans, life is finally returning to normal. Of course, this process takes time. Biodiversity has been greatly weakened, and it will take tens of thousands of years to restore the balance. After the crisis, another event will shake things up a bit and give a little boost to the order of living things. A warmer climate will lead to the melting of certain ice caps and higher ocean temperatures. These elements will then be conducive to the development of tabulate corals, hexacoralliarids and tetracoralliarids, as well as algae and stromatopores. On the subject of stromatopores, until a few years ago they were classified as belonging to the order of corals. They were thought to be closely related to the millipore, the hydrocorallia. However, according to the latest findings from fossil analyses of these organisms, they are more likely to be classified as sponges. Each of these species, from corals to algae and sponges, contributes to the construction of large reefs, particularly on intertropical plateaus. We'll soon be taking a closer look at reefs. Let's stay on the surface for a moment. Even today, reefs are teeming with life and form one of the essential pillars of many marine ecosystems. In Silurian times, this was also the case for many organisms. Reefs were home to a large number of species, providing food for other animals higher up the food chain. Speaking of the food chain, there's another element besides the reef that we sometimes forget to mention when we think of ocean ecosystems: plankton. Despite its small size, it's a very important element. The food chain is one of the building blocks of an ecosystem. Everyone has a place and a role to play in this ecosystem. Whether predator or prey, each species counts for the survival of all. Today, as in the Silurian era, the base of the marine food chain is made up of plankton. In fact, during this third Paleozoic era, phytoplankton and zooplankton were already present in the vast ocean. For the record, phytoplankton are all unicellular organisms present in the surface waters of the ocean and using photosynthesis as a source of energy. Zooplankton are animal plankton that feed directly or indirectly on phytoplankton. The Silurian period saw the appearance of Urnocchitina, Urna, and Fungochitina kosovensis, two marine plankton. In biology, they are known as chitinozoans. Like all marine species, phytoplankton and zooplankton were severely affected by the biological crisis at the end of the Silurian, but some have survived and even evolved. Until the beginning of the Ordovician period, graptolites belonged to the dendroid group, i.e. organisms with a planktonic lifestyle. But this was no longer the case. After undoubtedly passing through a pseudoplanktonic phase, a few million years later, they finally formed a class of colony-dwelling animals belonging to the Hemichordata phylum. Graptolites are rather strange colony-dwelling creatures floating in the water. These small marine organisms are colonial animals gathered around a main stem, with one individual serving as the central base, to which are attached small cells where each specimen lives. A real structure develops around it, forming a sort of living bell suspended in the water. But they can also cling to algae and form their colony around this attachment point if conditions require it for survival. Another important point to remember about graptolites is that they are stratigraphic. In other words, they enable us to situate sedimentary layers in time. The Llandovery period saw the appearance of Parachitograptus, Acamanatus, and Achidograptus ascensus. During the Wenlock, Cirtograptus centrifugus marks the beginning of the period. This is followed by Neo-Diversograptus nilsoni in the Ludlow period and Monograptus perultimus in the Prydolian. In 2015, a study carried out on fossil plankton dating back some 415 million years unlocked a number of mysteries, including some of the causes of mass extinction. Paleontologists have also noted a high proportion of malformed, so-called teratological individuals in fossil phytoplankton and zooplankton in sedimentary layers dating from the Ordovician Silurian period. These correspond to the initial stages of extinction events. After analysis, it turns out that these microorganisms contain a form of heavy metal pollution. Today, we know only too well the extent to which heavy metals have a negative impact on plankton. Scientists are well aware of the teratological effects of these metals. Toxins cause morphological abnormalities in aquatic organisms, and the presence of malformed individuals even serves as a tool for detecting possible contamination. Measurements of metal concentrations in some of these fossil specimens, as well as in the rocks surrounding them, reveal high concentrations of iron, lead, and arsenic. The abundance of these heavy metals in the fossils and rocks, combined with a high presence of teratological forms, suggests that the metals were absorbed by the organisms when they were alive and deposited in the surrounding sediments. While not the sole and principal cause of the major extinction, heavy metal pollution remains a contributing factor to the extinction phenomenon. Maybe it's time for us to go and meet some larger marine animals, don't you think? A few mollusks, some brachiopods, and many fish would like to testify to their history. What all these species have in common is the aquatic world. The fauna is almost exclusively marine, and in the end quite similar in all four corners of the globe. Some species settle in coastal regions, others prefer deeper waters. During the Ordovician period, we observed several species of mollusk. This large family continued to evolve during the Silurian. These, like the nautiloids, prefer coastal areas and shallow waters. Thanks to the sunlight penetrating the water, we should be able to see several fine specimens of these small marine organisms. I told you just now that many mollusks continued to evolve after the Ordovician during the Silurian. This means that a small handful did not. Not all nautiloids continued their development after the Ordovician. Giant nautiloids, for example, are less and less present in the Silurian. They survived the Ordovician, but during the Wenlock, the second period of the Silurian, they eventually became extinct, as in the case of the Camarasaurus genus. Other nautiloids diversified several million years ago, and the climatic and environmental conditions of the Silurian favored their development and diversification. Nautiloids include straight, curved, and even spiral shells. Not only did they survive the Ordovician crisis, but they also made it through the Cretaceous crisis unscathed, as the Nautilus and Allonautilus genera still exist today. Nautiloids belong to the tetrabranchial class of cephalopod mollusks, i.e. they have 4 gills. They live exclusively in open water. Nautiloid cephalopods have a distinctive shell. It spirals in a single plane. Inside there are several compartments, loges separated by partitions. The animal lives in the last compartment, called the living chamber. Although the animal only lives in one chamber, the other chambers are still useful. Each of these chambers contains a mixture of water and gas. Our little nautiloid is able to manage the volume of this mixture in the chambers thanks to the siphon that runs through them, allowing it to rise or fall deeper into the water. Most nautiloids are scavengers or opportunistic predators. In other words, they don't play hard to get and take what comes their way. During the previous period, the Ordovician, one nautiloid genus in particular had its heyday, Orthoceras. They were alpha predators, predators at the top of the food chain. But the giant Orthoceras will soon have to learn to be on its guard. Eurypterids made their grand entrance during the Silurian period. Here we see a Eurypterid, Acaturamus. It won't hesitate to attack the giant nautiloid if hunger strikes. But we'll have the chance to meet this new predator of the deep blue later on. In the Silurian, new genera of these cephalopods are also appearing, such as Pismoceras. Their shells are no longer completely planispiral, i.e. spiral-shaped on a single plane. The inner towers are detached from the outer towers. The Phragmoceras genus also boasts a rather singular morphology, with its shell shaped like a Phrygian cap. Phragmoceras, Eurystoma, and Phragmoceras dubium can be seen here. Phragmoceras is a nautiloid cephalopod mollusk with a distinctive curved shell in the shape of a Phrygian bonnet, rather than a coiled shell of today's nautilus, with almost two openings, one for the head and the other for the siphon. Among cephalopods, Actinoceratidae can also be found with a straight phragmocone. The phragmocone is the equivalent of the ostracum in other mollusks. It forms the partition part of the cephalopod shell. These mollusks have lived alongside other cephalopods, such as Ascoceratidae, Discoceratidae, Oncoceratidae, and Tarphoceratidae, whose spirally wound phragmocones are capable of floating. They also have a large siphon. Among the Discoricidae, it is interesting to observe one of the members of the genus, Gomphoceras. Unlike the other animals we saw, it too has a rather unusual shape. Most of the animal remains enclosed in the shell, leaving the tentacles and funnel to pass through. Its shape is convex and elongated, rather like a drop of water. Orthoceratidae can also be seen. They have a straight or slightly arched phragmocone. The siphon is narrow and variable in position, either straight or ringed. The cephalopods we've just discovered enjoy reefs and life in the shallow waters of our oceans, but so do brachiopods. Mollusks may be present, but brachiopods are in the majority and populate the Silurian oceans more widely. In a few million years' time, the balance will tip in the opposite direction. There will be fewer brachiopods and more mollusks during the Devonian. To give you an idea of this reversal, in the seas of the Primary Era, there were around 50 brachiopods for every bivalve. Today, there are far fewer brachiopods, with an estimated 1 brachiopod for every 50 bivalves. Brachiopods are marine animals that bear a striking resemblance to bivalves due to their two-valved shells. Without a little knowledge of the subject, they could easily be confused. In fact, these two groups are quite different in anatomy, and unlike bivalves, brachiopods are not mollusks. They are a group that belongs to the Lophophorians. This group also includes the Bryozoa and Phoronidia. Brachiopods are placed in the phylum Lophophorians because it is a phylum of invertebrates that possess a lophophore. A lophophore is a cylated apparatus that plays both a feeding and a respiratory role. It is this common characteristic that brings the bryozoans we have mentioned and the brachiopods together in the same class. The Paleozoic is the golden age of brachiopods, as it was during this long period that they were the most numerous and diverse. Although we still have many brachiopod specimens in our seas, as we have just mentioned, they remain less numerous than they were millions of years ago. These marine animals have a benthic or sessile lifestyle, which means they live attached to the seabed. To better understand these small animals, it's important to know that a benthic lifestyle means that the organisms live attached to the ground or move by skimming the bottom. They find their food in the sediment and thus depend on it for their sustenance. A sessile lifestyle, on the other hand, defines a lifestyle in which the organism is permanently attached to the substrate, i.e. the soil where it grows or develops. This is the case, for example, of sponges and corals. There are two types of valve articulation, the main criteria for classifying this marine group: articulated brachiopods, and inarticulated brachiopods. During the Silurian, articulated brachiopods diversified considerably. Unlike inarticulated brachiopods, the shells of articulated brachiopods remain fused even after the animal has died. Articulation is made possible by the presence of teeth on one valve, the peduncular valve, and dimples of complementary shapes on the other valve. Their two-valve shell is said to be asymmetrical and can be attached to the substrate. The larger valve is called the peduncular or ventral valve. The smaller one is commonly referred to as the dorsal or brachial valve. To attach itself, the brachiopod had a peduncle attached to an orifice called the foramen. At the commissure, the joint between the two shells, we can see a wavy shape running along the edges. It is precisely these small undulations that differentiate brachiopods from bivalves, where the commissure is smooth. Silurian brachiopods include Orthidae, Strophimenidae, Pentameridae, Rhynchonellidae, Spiriferidae, and Terbratullidae. The Strophimenidae are an order of articulated brachiopods that live from the lower Ordovician to the middle Carboniferous periods. They are part of the extinct class of Strophimenata, which was the largest known order of brachiopods, encompassing over 400 genera. All these small marine animals roam a rich seascape that supports the development of biodiversity. As you can see, this landscape is very varied in shallow waters. You can even see some very unusual animals. Sea lilies, also known as crinoids, populate Silurian oceans, as do Scyphocrinites, elgans. Like sea urchins and starfish, they belong to the echinoderms. They first appeared in the Ordovician period, but expanded greatly in the Silurian. They still exist today. Because of their shape and name, they are often mistaken for sea flowers, but they are really limestone animals, not plants. Take a closer look at Scyphocrinites elgans and you'll see what I mean. It has pinnules at the top of its articulated arms, a kind of small feather that enables it to capture plankton. The arms are grouped together and attached to the central part, the calyx, which itself rests on the stem. At the end of this stem, the sea lily has spikes. These hold it in place on the ground. Other similar animals have found their way to the seabed. Karyocrinites, for example, are also echinoderms, and they are expanding rapidly. Here you can see a Karyocrinites ornatus. These coral reefs have gradually become established, particularly in the Lapitous Ocean, between Proto-Gondwana and Laurasia. They have become the preferred home of the nautiloids we saw, as well as brachiopods. A little further on, we can see the famous Ordovician trilobites, which have diversified considerably since their appearance, a few million years ago. For all these little animals, these reefs at the bottom of the ocean could have been like paradise. But that was without counting on the arrival of a larger arthropod, the Eurypterid. Eurypterids are undoubtedly the most emblematic species of the period, and for good reason. The Silurian is known as the golden age of these sea scorpions. You have to imagine that these arthropods can reach absolutely extraordinary sizes, like this Eurypterid, Pterygotus. It is almost 2 meters long. During the Silurian period, it was the largest predator on the planet. No living organism rivals it in size or power. As a result, it quickly became a formidable predator, rising to the top of the food chain. More than 100 different species of Eurypterid are thought to have existed. They varied in size, but the largest specimens could reach between 2 meters 50 and 3 meters 60, or between 8 and 12 feet. This group includes Eurypterus, Megalograptus, and Pterygotus, which we have just seen. As we said earlier in our trip, the Eurypterid is a marine arthropod. Morphologically, it resembles a scorpion, hence its nickname sea scorpion. It is related to arachnids and crustaceans. Although closely related to the scorpion, the horseshoe crabs we still encounter today are their closest cousins. The Eurypterid belongs to the meristome group, like horseshoe crabs, and not to the arachnid group like scorpions. The Eurypterid is easy to identify. It can be recognized by its elongated body and large articulated tail. Its sting is visible at the end of the tail. However, unlike the scorpions we know today, it turns out that this sting contained no venom. At least that's what we know today. The Eurypterid also has a pair of fin-like legs and giant sharp pincers. These are highly efficient at cutting and crushing prey. While some species of this genus were undoubtedly opportunists, feeding on corpses found here and there on the ocean floor, other Eurypterids were fine predators. Their size was an asset, and to reach such dimensions, the environment and living conditions had to be right. At that time, oxygen levels were higher. Experiments have shown that the richer the oxygen content of the aquatic or terrestrial environment, the larger the insects, and in our case, the Eurypterati. As we just mentioned, Eurypterids were among the largest predators of their time, and quickly rose to the top of the chain. They hunted trilobites in deep water. Trilobites look a bit like aquatic sobugs. What applies to Eurypterids in terms of size also applies to trilobites. There were species as small as a few millimeters, but also some very large specimens. Some were as much as 75 centimeters or 30 inches long. So predators adapted to this type of morphology were needed. Their rigid dorsal carapace, rich in calcium carbonate, fossilized easily, hence their abundance in sediments. On the other hand, the underside and appendages are rarely preserved, and are known from only a dozen or so species. Eurypterids and trilobites have another thing in common. Like all arthropods, they grew throughout their lives by successive molts. If Eurypterids were formidable predators, it's because they were perfectly equipped to become the greatest marine predators of their time. Many marine animals with tails can only move them horizontally. In sea scorpions, the tail was virtually inflexible horizontally, but highly mobile vertically. According to the researchers, sea scorpions were thus able to bend their tails and project them far onto their targets. They would assault and kill their prey with lateral attacks using their toothed tails. This is what the recent study of a fossilized specimen, that of Slemonia acuminata, has revealed. Eurypterids have been numerous and highly diversified over the years, but they have also evolved. Soon, in the Carboniferous period in particular, Eurypterids such as Adelophthalmus pyrrhae were able to breathe in the open air, whereas until then they had been aquatic specimens. Their shells were also able to withstand atmospheric pressure in the open air. In other words, from time to time they might be able to get onto dry land without any difficulty at all. For now, we're going to continue our journey into the open sea to discover the many other species that inhabit the vast ocean. Yes, we haven't had time to meet any fish yet, but as you'll see, the history of this group during the Silurian period is full of twists and turns. Fish evolved a lot, especially at the end of the Silurian. But let's take a step back to better understand these changes. The first chordate organisms appeared in the Cambrian. It was from this chord that the vertebral column was derived, to which muscles could be attached, giving them greater mobility. During the Ordovician period, organisms such as Sacabambaspis, Arandaspis, and Astraspis developed an exoskeleton. This external carapace protected the anterior part of their body, leaving the posterior part flexible to facilitate movement of their only limb, their tail. They were thus the first craniites to appear. Crania are the clade of animals with a cartilaginous or bony skull, protecting the anterior part of the nervous system. They belong to the ostracoderms. With no lateral fins, they use only the power of their tails to navigate the ocean floor. The evolution of fish had pretty much come to a halt here at the end of the Ordovician period. Although there were a few outlines of evolution, they were mainly fixed and developed in the Silurian. Several groups of fossil vertebrates with mineralized skeletons but no jaws are known. These groups, also known as ostracoderms, are the Aranidaspids, Astraspids, Heterostracans, Anaspids, Galeaspids, Pituriaspids, Osteostracans, and Thelodonts. Let's take a moment to differentiate some of these major groups in Silurian fishes. First of all, let's review some basic fish vocabulary. Ostracoderm fish are essentially bottom-dwelling fish with massive bony armor. They are also often referred to as agnathans or jawless fish. Agnathans, the jawless fish that appeared discreetly in the Ordovician period, diversified. Alongside the common-shaped anaspids, we find groups with increasingly varied shapes. The dart-shaped Heterostracans, the ray-like Osteostracans, and the more pot-bellied Thelodonts. Let's start with the anapsids. And to discover this group, we're going to look at an exceptional member, Burkinia. It's a little shorter than the others, measuring around 10 centimeters or 4 inches. Like the others, however, it has neither jaws nor fins. It is also distinguished by a complex set of dorsal scales. Anapsids generally have 6 to 25 gills, but the Burkinia genus has 30. This one is a Burkinia elegans. It's probably a filter feeder. Ostracoderms are, so to speak, the most advanced of the agnathans. Although they still have a long way to go, these fish are increasingly well adapted to their environment and equipped to defend themselves against predators. Among the members of the anapsids, the anaspid, Pharyngolepis oblongus, stands out. It has no facial shield but a rather elongated shape with a well-developed anal fin. It measures between 10 and 25 centimeters, 4 and 10 feet. Among the telodonts, we could go and meet the telodont Loganellia scotica, an agnathus measuring around 25 centimeters or 10 feet. It has no scales but plate armor. We can see that it's more paunchy and quite different morphologically from the anapsids, despite their few similarities. Another genus stands out from the others, the heterostracans. Heterostracans have an anterior dermal shield and scales on their body and tail. As you can see, the front of these fish is very pronounced. They are shaped like arrows or horseshoes at the front. Heterostracans are agnathic vertebrates. They can be recognized by their single-bone facial shield. This is known as the anterior dermal shield. This no longer grows once the animal reaches adulthood. Another distinctive feature is their flattened body, with a mouth on top of the head and scales covering the body and tail. Their closest relatives today are hagfish. One of the Silurian specimens is the Pteraspis. This fish has a double shield of dorsal and ventral plates. It also has a rostrum, an elongated appendage that some animals, both vertebrates and invertebrates, can have, such as the saw shark. Although it doesn't really have fins as such, the Pteraspis has a lobed tail, a carapace, and a rostrum that make it very aerodynamic underwater. And then, if you look a little closer, you'll notice that its carapace has a few wing-like protuberances on the sides, which also enable it to compete with the best Silurian swimmers. The spine you see on the back of its carapace isn't very useful for swimming, but it was undoubtedly very useful for warding off predators. Pteraspis' favorite food is plankton. It therefore lived on the surface rather than in the depths. During the Silurian period, there were several species of Pteraspis, including Pteraspis croci and Pteraspis rostrata. One fish bears a close resemblance to Pteraspis, a close cousin, so to speak. It's the Rhinopteraspis dunensis. You'll notice that, like it has a carapace, a rostrum, and defensive spines on its back. Both measure between 20 and 30 centimeters. Earlier, we also mentioned Galeaspids. These fish also belong to the agnathan group. They are primitive fish that had neither fins nor jaws. One member of the genus is called Shuyu, Jejiengensis. Here is another member of the group, Laxaspis. The distinctive head armor is still recognizable. Our little sojourn with the agnathans is drawing to a close, but our journey with the fishes is not over yet. Indeed, the evolution of these fish is not the only great revolution concerning them. One of the great events of the Silurian period was the arrival of jawed fish, the gnathostomes. Their jaws were formed from the second branchial arch of agnathans. The first jawed vertebrates, or gnathostomes, were the spiny-finned acanthodians and the placoderms, which enclosed the front of their bodies in a bony carapace. The acanthodonian, Climatius reticulatus, was one of the first jawed vertebrates. It is easily distinguished by the small ventral spines that support its fin. Acanthodians are evolutionarily unusual in that they combine the characteristics of bony fish, osteichthyans, and cartilaginous fish, chondrichthyans. During the Ordovician period, the oceans were populated by so-called ostracoderms, armored fish with a dermal bone armor. As we have seen, these fish also belong to the agnathans. They were still widely present in the Silurian, but at the end of the Ordovician and beginning of the Silurian, the arrival of placoderm fish, and above all, gnathostome fish, i.e. fish with jaws, completely overturned the marine world. But don't make any wrong assumptions. Jaws do not necessarily mean teeth. The placoderm fish group has undergone two major revolutions. Unlike ostracoderms, they had an articulated armor, mainly on the front of the body, composed of plates reminiscent of turtle shells. The other strong point of these fish is, of course, their jaws. Their jaws end in bony outgrowths. This type of jaw can also be seen in modern turtles. We'll have to wait a little longer to see real teeth in fish. Nevertheless, this primitive jaw remains powerful and perfectly suited to the task of predation. What's more, even if the teeth haven't fully erupted yet, we can see bony outgrowths that are undoubtedly the first signs of this biological evolution. Placoderms are referred to as gnathal plates rather than teeth, with the upper, supraognathal plate resting on the lower, infraognathal jawbone. This set of plates with their occlusal zones acted like scissors. This is particularly true of the fish we're looking at here, Entelognathus primordialis. It has several fins, a long tail, and a very distinctive face. It's the first to display what resembles a face, with its distinctive position of eyes, nose, and mouth. When you observe an ostracoderm, such as the anaspid, Pharyngolepis oblongus, and a placoderm such as Entelognathus primordialis, you'll notice that there are several other very distinct differences between these two groups of fish. Firstly, the placoderm's armor is no longer only on the head, but all along the body. Scales are also clearly visible. Morphologically, the most striking feature is undoubtedly the presence of fins. These fish have real limbs expressly designed for swimming. This group is therefore undergoing a major evolutionary process. With the appearance of fins, placoderm fish are able to move more precisely, swimming better and faster. Its carapace protects it from other marine animals, and above all, it acquires a powerful jaw, capable of defeating its prey, making it a good marine predator. To conclude on the hatching of the gnathostomes, it should be noted that this group gave rise sometime later to two major groups that we still know today: the cartilaginous fishes and the bony fishes. The analysis of an Entelognathus primordialis fossil turned all our beliefs and knowledge about fish classes and evolutionary theories on their head. Until the discovery of Entelognathus, it was considered that the placoderm skeleton had nothing to do with that of bony fish, and that the two had appeared separately. It was therefore thought that cartilaginous fish, similar to rays and sharks, had given rise to bony fish. But Entelognathus has small cranial bones and jaw bones. Placoderms are therefore the direct ancestors of modern fish. Vertebrates were undoubtedly endowed with a bony skeleton from the start. Indeed, the external dermal bones they possess are similar to those of osteichthyans, so they probably have the same origin. This means that the evolutionary position of sharks has changed dramatically. This revelation refines our knowledge of a whole area of paleobiology. Fossils still have much to teach us. Discoveries such as these shed a little more light on our distant past. Let's leave placoderms for a completely different kind of fish. Even if they don't belong to the gnathostomes per se, it would be interesting to meet some conodonts. These very special fish certainly have a lot to teach us and help us discover. The genus Wormelia, for example, particularly Wormelia inflata, was present in the oceans of the Paleozoic era. These animals are rather difficult to describe and rather unusual, even frightening despite their small size. They don't have jaws, yet they have small teeth. It may seem paradoxical, but they're not the only animals to have teeth but no jaws. This is the case of hagfish and lampreys, for example. Hagfish are necrophagous and lampreys parasitic. A 2012 study published in Proceedings of the Royal Society B sheds some light on this animal, which is certainly a vertebrate, and its mode of nutrition, since it possessed a rather original teething system. According to the study, the scientists, a group of British and Australians, were able to uncover, through tooth wear, the workings of their distinctive dentition. Teeth functioned in pairs, one opposite the other, exerting rotational movements to crush food. Finally, the absence of jaws prevented these fish from exerting strong pressure, but they managed to compensate for the problem with very sharp teeth. After all these marine encounters, we can affirm that even if the Silurian is a short period, it was marked by numerous events and major biological evolutions in the marine world. Marine biodiversity developed and enriched considerably during the Silurian. But what about on land? Terrestrial life is limited to a narrow band of wetlands around rivers and lagoons, but even if it's still limited, it's there. Both fragile and firmly rooted in the soil, it is determined to conquer dry land. But as you can imagine, it didn't all happen in a day. It took several million years to reach the narrow, wet, life-rich Silurian strip of land. After the evolutionary radiation of the Cambrian, also known as the Cambrian explosion, so important was the development of life, and after the Ordovician radiation, which was also very rich and important, the arrival of the first arthropods on Earth is without doubt the most important revolution in the history of life on Earth. It is symbolic. It marks the beginning of all possibilities. Plants were the first to colonize terra firma, as early as the Ordovician period, 470 million years ago, fundamentally altering the geosphere. Oxygenation of the atmosphere, formation of soils, and new climatic and sedimentary regimes. Until then, however, plants were virtually alone in the world. However, mycorrhizae, symbiotic associations between plant roots and soil fungi, not only give plants better access to soil nutrients, but also help to weather the rock. In other words, together they pave the way for a biotope worthy of the name. When arthropods finally land on the continent, they bring with them the very first terrestrial ecosystem. Arthropods were the first animals to take the plunge, along with myriapods and arachnids in the Silurian 430 million years ago. They opened the door to the hexapods, the insects, which in turn landed on land at the beginning of the Devonian, as well as to other animals straight out of the water. In all, 7 arthropod groups independently reached land: myriapods, arachnids, hexapods, and at least 4 crustacean groups, including sobugs and crabs. Vertebrates were therefore the last to colonize continental environments, only at the end of the Devonian. In fact, vertebrates could not have left the water as quickly as arthropods, for the simple reason that the latter were better equipped to cope with the many anatomical and physiological problems of life on land. Arthropods will play an essential role in soil development and the decomposition and recycling of nutrients. To better understand this very first ecosystem, let's go back a few million years to observe the beginnings of the very first plant cover. The oldest fossils of land plants date back to the beginning of the Middle Ordovician period, some 470 million years ago. We're going to find part of the fossil of these first plants, their spores. While the lack of complete fossils limits our knowledge of these early plants, it does enable us to date their appearance. A little later in the Silurian, we began to find fossils of a different kind. This time we can analyze fossil remains of plant stems and roots from around 430 million years ago. These fossils include the first vascular plants, also known as tracheophytes, which transport water and mineral salts throughout the plant. Vascular plants, which produce more acids than algae or lichens and have a much more developed root system, offer a larger contact surface. It is therefore highly likely that they have intensified alteration of the substrate, i.e., the soil in which they grow. With these first plants, the Earth was able to welcome its new inhabitants. Numerous morphological and physiological transformations were required in both plants and animals before living organisms could adapt to life on land. While the aquatic world is not always the most peaceful, life on the surface is harsh and much more unstable. Arthropods, thanks to their rigid shells, have been able to overcome the first difficulty posed by atmospheric pressure on a body, a difficulty that until now was not so problematic since the organisms lived in water. Another problem faced by the Earth's first settlers was reproduction out of water. In the early days, animals living on land still reproduced in an aquatic environment. It wasn't until a few further evolutions, and above all major biological revolutions such as the amniotic egg, that this obstacle was overcome. But we're not there yet. Far from it. Plants first tried to conquer new territories, gradually establishing themselves on the continent during the Silurian period. In previous eras, green algae, cyanobacteria, and lichens had gradually settled on land. Until then, only lichen had managed to make a real place for itself. But in the early Silurian, moss also managed to establish itself. Despite the light presence of this vegetation on the Earth's surface, the landscape remains close to desolation. It's a far cry from a lush forest. However, something is about to change during the Silurian period. Water brought sediments to the coasts, and these sediments were a godsend for certain plants that could cling to the ground while taking advantage of the nearby water. This is how Cooksonia hatches, a plant with a stem and a kind of ball at its tip. Its average height is 10 centimeters or 4 feet. But this height is enough for Cooksonia to spread its spores through the air and reproduce. Soon, Cooksonia is carpeting coastal landscapes. Cooksonia thrives but still encounters some adaptation difficulties. Until now, plants didn't have to withstand atmospheric pressure, or at least, through water, they could withstand it much more easily. In the course of evolution, they adopted a new skeleton, better suited to life on land. During the Middle Silurian, another major evolution took place in these plants. They were equipped with stomata, small orifices that enabled them to breathe through the air. In this way, plants will acquire new abilities to adapt to their new environment. In water, nutrients were more readily available. On land, they are faced with rock. To overcome this problem, they acquire rhizomes. These are the beginnings, so to speak, of roots. Thanks to these, they can absorb nutrients from the soil, and above all, redistribute them, even to the plant's highest organs. It was not until a few million years later that plants completed their panoply with outgrowths. These will enable them to capture more of the sun's rays and thus grow. For each plant to succeed, it sometimes had to climb much higher than the others. At that time, ferns were much larger than those we know today, for example. Even if vegetation was still very limited in the Silurian, it still helped new species to flourish. On land, there are indeed some plant species, but also animals that are just beginning their journey on Earth. In the Silurian, vegetation was still in its infancy, but this was enough for myriapods and arachnids such as mites, spiders, and scorpions to adapt to a terrestrial environment. Arachnids form a class of animals that is often confused with and limited to spiders. Although spiders are indeed part of this class, they are not the only members. This class also includes scorpions, mites, ticks, and opilions. What distinguishes this group is that its members have 4 pairs of legs, neither wings nor antennae, and their ocelli, or eyes, are simple rather than compound, as in dragonflies, for example. Arachnids are also arthropods, i.e. they have a segmented body, and are more specifically chelicerae arthropods. They have chelicerae. These chelicerae are appendages close to the mouth that end in hooks or pincers. If you've been paying attention during our trip, this description probably reminds you of our famous Eurypterids. You're quite right to make the connection, as they are both chelicerae arthropods. The arachnid order is included in the class of these chelicerae arthropods. Eurypterids are also included, as they too have mouth-like appendages that end in hooks or pincers. Unlike our first encounter with Eurypterids, this time we're not looking for members of these chelicerae arthropods in the water, but on land. With the help of vegetation, spiders, scorpions, and even myriapods have managed to make a little space for themselves. As you probably know by now, the first clawed arthropods of the chelicerae suborder appeared around 540 million years ago, during the Cambrian, the oldest period of the Paleozoic era. Most adapted to life on land. But during the Silurian period, the first scorpions and spiders settled on the continent, or at least left a trace of their passage on Earth. Yes, let's not forget that distant history is a very special science. Scientists rely on current knowledge, technology, and of course, first and foremost, on fossils. Unfortunately, it's not always possible to find remnants of the distant past. Based on analysis of the elements currently in our possession, it appears that the first scorpions and spiders on the continent date back to the Silurian. However, future discoveries may update or refine this information. Among Silurian arachnids, the scorpion genus and the spider genus in particular are found on Earth. Earlier, we met a sea scorpion. This time it's a land scorpion, Paleophonus. The scorpion is about 7 centimeters long. Yes, larger plants in newly enriched soils are enriching biodiversity. We can see spiders, scorpions, and myriapods. Paleophonus, our scorpion, has a way of life that still raises questions. He lived on Earth, that's a fact. At least that's what the fossil evidence suggests. Now, whether it was exclusively terrestrial, mainly aquatic and on dry land at times, or aquatic in its juvenile form and then terrestrial as an adult, the question remains unanswered. The sting at the end of its tail, also called telson, is undoubtedly venomous, unlike the eurypterids we've seen. In the spider, there are clear similarities and differences with the scorpion. In the scorpion, the abdomen extends into a postabdomen called the tail. In the spider, the body is composed of 2 parts, but the head and thorax are combined into a single part, called the cephalothorax. The second part is the abdomen. It is on the cephalothorax that we find the 4 pairs of locomotive legs and the chelicerae. While the finest fossil specimens date from the Devonian, Paleocorinus rhinensis lived on Earth at the end of the Silurian. It belongs to the order Triganotarbida. Spiders of the order Triganotarbidae do not yet have silk-producing spinnerets, unlike the majority of predatory spiders today. Examples include Cryptomartis brebski, Pneumodesmus also lived on Earth at the same time. This time we're dealing with a myriapod. It is undoubtedly the first of this group to take its first steps on the continent. This ancestor of millipedes marks an important stage in the conquest of the terrestrial environment by arthropods, as it is the oldest terrestrial animal discovered to exhibit typical air breathing. The opening of the trachea is visible on the fossil segments found, suggesting a terrestrial life. It would then be necessary to wait patiently for biological evolution to continue before other organisms manage to live on the continent. To conclude our journey into the Silurian, it's worth remembering that this was a transitional period between the Ordovician and Devonian eras. It was a period when plants and certain arthropods finally succeeded in conquering the land, but also when primitive fish made their grand entrance among aquatic animals. Primitive fish that would later give rise to a major revolution in the world of life. The acanthodians gave rise to the osteichthyans, or bony fish, which in turn gave rise to the sarcopterygians. These in turn gave rise to the crossopterygians. All these groups may not mean much to you, as they're pretty hard names to remember, but you should know that during the Devonian period, the crossopterygians gave rise to the first tetrapods, which you may be more familiar with, since this large group includes, for example, dinosaurs and birds, amphibians, reptiles, and mammals. But that's another period, another story, another journey through time.